Hello, 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 everyone. I hope that you're all doing well. Let me just switch over here. Hello, hello. Hope everyone's doing well. It's, of course, the Shakespeare show. It should be working now. Okay, yeah. Wanted to make sure. So, for today, yay, you can hear me. Good, good. So, for today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about El Salvador. Possibly, maybe talking about Mexico, too. We're going to be talking about what's going on in Pakistan, and also possibly some discussion about the farmers' strike in India. And of course, we have to talk about Bidenomics. There's an economics YouTuber that I think is actually, on the whole, pretty good. He's definitely, like if you want to know like economics papers, right? Like if you want to know kind of research in that way, he's definitely the place to go for that. One of the things that I also did want to show was my new little Kuromi box. I think it's so cute. Isn't that so cute? I don't know. I just like Kuromi stuff. I just think it's really cute. But it's just a box. It's literally just a box. It doesn't even come with a ghost. So let me get us started. Hope everyone's doing well. I couldn't stream yesterday. I was feeling kind of stiff, like right here in my neck, and I'm still feeling kind of like pain there right now, but trying to get through it. Because we kind of have to, as proletarians, so yeah. So we're going to first talk about Pakistan. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. There we go.
Announced plans to try to form a government following disputed elections. The chairman of Khan's PTI party says it started by forming an alliance with a smaller party. Imran Khan himself, seen here in archive footage, is in prison. His party has accused the state of a crackdown against its members.
I have a small session to attend, so have fun here. Don't let the fun stop without me. Okay. So let me know if you come back while I'm still streaming, and if not, then I can talk about the microfinance next stream. Okay, Holy Lazy Duck?
And of vote rigging. Allegations the state denies.
Have a good time at the session.
Despite being banned, PTI candidates ran as independents and won the most seats in this election.
Simapia Tahir lost the vote in a constituency in the city of Rawalpindi.
So one thing to note here is so perhaps it's already understood by some, right? And again, I want to make sure that it's very clear that Imran Khan doesn't necessarily, right, like some people in the West might see him as in a way that perhaps a South Asian Marxist would not, right? And so that's one thing I want to be very careful. Like I'm discussing this in terms of like how the news is presenting the situation, but I would not presume to say, I know all of the details. But one thing I do want to stress is that remember that this is a parliamentary election, and another thing too is the fact that Imran Khan has not necessarily been... Yeah, Imran Khan is a rich bourgeoisie. Yes, exactly. Was like a movie star or something like that, from what I remember. He was the most popular candidate that got couped. Yeah, precisely. And in Pakistan, there is a kind of cricket champion. Pardon me. Yes, cricket champion. Where again, one of the things that's kind of important is that the military has played an outsized role in its governance for quite some time, And that has to deal, again, with the history of the country since partition, right? And that is another thing to stress, right? Whilst it is a parliamentary democracy, right, we should, right, from a socialist perspective, also understand that that does not mean, yeah, I think he was in films. Like, that's kind of where I think I perhaps have seen, like, or heard of him. Perhaps, but I could be wrong. So, again, like, thank you for reminding me about him being a cricketer, because I do remember that now that you have refreshed my memory. But yeah, I think, yeah, you're completely right. He could have had a entertainment career for sure. And I think that's what I'm remembering. But if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, right?
But she refuses to accept the result. She campaigned with the backing of Imran Khan's PTI party. Now she's mobilizing her supporters and protesting against what she believes was a rigged vote count.
So, yeah, like the idea of it being a rigged vote count, the idea of it, you know, does anybody believe that, like, that's kind of the way how Al Jazeera, like, titled their video on this, like, does anyone believe the election results? And that is, again, we must be aware that the idea of, say, the United States or any other, right, imperialist party trying to sway the elections in one way or another would not be the first time that this has happened. So it's not to say that they don't, you know, that's the other thing too, is we need to take a step back and look at everything from a Marxian perspective and understand that that as well, right? Because, you know, Pakistan was part of the Belt and Road Initiative, still is, right? So far as I know, I haven't read anything in the news. Definitely not in English language Chinese media that has said that they've stopped being part of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? But that's allowed for lots of Chinese investment, right? Including the acquisition by the PRC of the port of Gwadar, which, again, the United States does very similar things. In fact, in many ways, even worse. Well, actually, like, admittedly, like, far, far worse things with the way in which it goes about its imperialism. However, like, people like to overstress certain aspects of China's, like corporate control of the port of Piraeus in Greece, or of Gwadar in Pakistan. So, so that isn't to say that China isn't imperialist, but that whatever stress is emphasized in Western media needs to be taken, with a huge grain of salt as well. So, like, these elections are contentious precisely because of the imperialistic nature of the different factions representing perhaps different spheres of influence, one might say.
The police dispersed the rally. A police case is filed against her and other supporters for disrupting public order. Simapia is just one of the many PTI-backed independent candidates who say they were not allowed a level playing field for campaigning before elections. They were forced to do door-to-door campaigns. They complained their rallies were disrupted and their members arrested. The party headed into elections with their leader Imran Khan in jail and their electoral symbol removed, forcing PTI candidates to run as independents. With the election over, PTI-backed candidates are now flooding the courts with vote-rigging allegations, something the Pakistani state continues.
China haven't really meddled in someone's politics, right? Right. I wanted to make sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, they haven't really meddled in someone's politics, and in fact, that's the reason why many countries have preferred, again, it's still imperialism, but at the same time, if it's that's one of the things that perhaps people have noted is that, it's one in which, the ideological requirement that Western imperialism requires in particular, right, which typically leads to despotic rule, right, not democratic rule, as we well know, is something that, again, has made, there are countries who benefited from their loans and infrastructure project, like the current deal with Indonesia, where they get high-speed rail and technology transfer. Oh, right, like, exactly. Like, I mean, Indonesia, as we well know, right, like, it wants to build its brand new capital because Jakarta is quite literally, is sinking into the ground because, I mean, it was built not even that long ago, when it was first started as a Dutch, settlement. And now, right, we're seeing sort of the effects of, because I mean, I forget what percentage of the world's population, but it's like, percentage of the world's population, right? Like a palpable percentage lives on just the Isle of Java, right, in Indonesia. And so the fact that they want to move the capital to Kalimantan, believe that's how you pronounce the name of the island. In fact, I actually think I'm shortening it. But essentially, I think that's the name of the city, but the island is called Borneo, the island of Borneo, which is where they have their land border with Malaysia. Means that they require a lot of foreign investment. And one place where they've been able to get that with, no necessarily political strings attached, as Powerful Finger is noting, is from China. That doesn't mean that China doesn't exploit clearly corrupt governments and only the money in betting projects. Right, and that's the reason why people that will try to, hello, Phoenix Dragon, welcome in. Right, and that's one of the, if that's really the main critique that you could make of the Chinese system, for sure. Like the people that want to complain about it as such, that's really the only thing they could say. Or if they are liberals, they will say, the United States and the West somehow represents good as such, right? And that's very problematic, as people might think. Hello, Phoenix Dragon. I'm so glad that you're here. How are you? So yeah, I mean, again, that's the reason why, many countries, many countries do choose to, their governments do choose to align with, at least in the economic sense, right, with the People's Republic of China.
Is to deny. Yet, despite the many hurdles, PTI-backed candidates still won the most seats, a performance that shocked many.
Oh, stream engineering. That sounds fascinating. I presume that must mean something like coordinating between those things. Oh, thank you so much. And yes, I appreciate that, and I'm so happy about that. Yes, I am one of the newest members. Oh, really? Soundbot and emo walls. Okay. Nice. Very nice. Oh, good. That's good to know. I mean, USAID African countries. Oh, USAID African countries. Despite most of them having million people living without. Oh, yeah. I mean, and if anything, right, it particularly leaves it susceptible, right? And it does this purposefully, right? To having, right, NGOs, right, fill in the gaps, as they will often say, right? And by that, it's that's how they promote right-wing extremist Christian agendas, right? In Uganda and Kenya, etc. So it's they, that's where a lot of that happens too. It's instead of actually helping people's, living standard and general quality of life, go up, instead they are, essentially trying to make it so that they can extract more resources. I mean, again, if we must question the fact, the fact that how is it that, so many of the minerals that are required to make, for example, I'll just use one example, Tesla cars, come from the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And yet it's one of the most war-torn areas, right? From a sort of a factional civil war, right? It should stand to reason then that it should be almost impossible to extract resources from there. Yet the extraction of resources is constant, right? Same thing with Syria, right? Where even Trump was celebrating the fact that the United States is quite literally stealing the oil, right, from the Syrian oil field. So Yeah, China's role in DRC is very questionable, right? And I mean that's the reason why I think that like there are definitely some aspects where like perhaps like the older techniques of like or techniques methods used during China's growth right period might not necessarily remain right as it goes on, right? Especially now living in an age where inter-imperialist conflict is becoming more and more of a certainty, right? Like where it's more palpable.
In Pakistan, leaders who run afoul of the powerful military rarely find electoral success. But candidates like Simabia Tahir say they will continue to fight legal battles till they get answers from the Pakistani authorities.
Our reporter
Cuba has a lot of cobalt, yet they would rather go in DRC to help them develop mining industry and not have exploitation of labor like it's present in DRC. Right. Right. Yeah, because of course then it would have to like one of the things that like the Soviet Union had to do was that it had to pay a premium, right, on the sugar. Well, I mean, it was one could argue, at least from the economics perspective, even from Marxian economic perspective, that the USSR's purchasing of the entire sugar crop, right, of Cuba made it so that right Cuba was not able to develop industrially. But regardless of that, yeah, Cuba has the third largest reserve of cobalt. Yeah, that would mean that they would not be able to get it, for the, imperial super profits, right, as much as they could in the DRC, where there was essentially no oversight, no real protections for the workers, etc. So,
Java just returned from.
And I mean, again, like that's one of the reasons why the liberalization of the Cuban economy has also meant that the United States still will not give up its embargo, because one thing it would love to do is to still, force Cuba to either, capitulate, right, and thus imperialize it, once more, fully imperialize it once more, or to, again, have concessions slowly be given out, and especially in that case, right, with cobalt as well.
Pakistan. Binesh, tell us more about the PTI and its efforts to form some sort of government.
So today, PTI, headed by Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan, has announced that they will form an alliance with a small party in the center. This will give them legitimacy. This will allow them to have access to reserve seats quota in the parliament. It will also stop the practice of horse trading, because once these PTI-backed independent candidates become part of an alliance of a party, then by rule they cannot switch sides. So this also gives PTI some sort of strength that their PTI-backed candidates will not leave the party. But this is just an announcement. To form a government, they still need a lot of numbers. PTI still claims that they have enough numbers to form a government. They have challenged the results of several of the seats. They are going to the courts, to the Election Commission of Pakistan.
The USSR had really weird relations with their allies. I'm not defending Ceausescu. He did a lot of bad things, but they were constantly pressured by Moscow to be agricultural and an agricultural country rather than being self-sufficient as they possibly can. Right, and I mean even within the USSR, right, like Moldova, like just across the border in Moldova, like that became also an issue that's still kind of felt to this day in many ways, because of the fact that Moldova was where like most of the wine in the USSR and in the Eastern Bloc in general tended to be, I mean, a lot of it definitely was grown. So like instead of also to stay as agricultural as possible in order to again supply, and again that like that's one of the things too, where like the necessity for industrial production, right, so that then you can have the control by the workers of the means of production is very important, because again, like keeping it in the agricultural state, unnecessarily, one could argue, and I think that's one aspect too as well, that you're sort of saying, a powerful finger, is the fact then that is that then that means that self-sufficiency, or the ability to, develop an economy that is more stable and not dependent upon the importation of, agricultural machinery, fertilizers, right, industrial fertilizer, et cetera, doesn't become, so expensive to the point where then the area becomes highly indebted as well. Agricultural goods are low value, right? I see what you're saying. You're depleting land when you focus on high yield rather than focusing only on feeding your people, right? And in fact, kind of one of the things I was saying right now is the need for high yields is the reason why, in the United States, they want every crop to be a bumper crop, right? Like, they always have to be producing more and more, and it just destroys the soil. And then it requires them to use more industrial fertilizer, right? Like, there's nothing real there, right? It's them, doing something that by definition is destroying the very soil, right, by which they're getting those bumper crops. So, yeah.
And they say that they have evidence and they're hopeful that results will favor them and that they will be able to eventually form the government on their own. But there is also a high possibility that they will not be able to form the government and they will probably then sit in the opposition.
It sounds like a whole lot of PR work to me. But what about other parties?
So other parties are PMLN, that got the second highest vote, and PPP that got the third highest vote. And today, PPP, a party that announced that got the third highest vote, and it is headed by Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, who's son of Pakistan's former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. They have announced that they will support the second party that won the most votes, PMLN, in forming the government. So basically, they have sort of announced that they will not be in a coalition government, which means that the party that wants the second highest vote, PMLN, as of now, it looks like they will eventually form a minority government.
This all sounds like it's going to end up being some sort of watered down coalition. I mean, what Pakistan needs at the moment is a strong government with the legitimacy to tackle such huge problems like the economy, security.
And the entire election activity was to end political instability in Pakistan, to have a strong, stable government. But in the run-up to election, one party, PTI, completely accused of a complete sidelining from the political process. They're accused of being target of a military-led crackdown. And then after elections, we saw that because no party was able to gain majority, and there is still a lot of public support and sentiment towards PTI, it seems like it's going to be a very weak government, a government that's not credible, a government that's being formed with accusations of vote rigging and vote irregularities.
I mean, I think to me, one thing that's kind of also now brought into the world, I would say, because of the whole stuff in the United States, is now the prior to this, right? In the United States, saying that denying the efficacy and the ability of the U.S. electoral system, right, to give us a true result as such, right? That questioning by, capitalists in particular, has made it so that now it's actually possible to say something like that, right? The reason why Trump was able to deny it and can continue to deny it, and why people that support him can, is essentially because, again, he's a capitalist. And so it's not as though, so because of that, right, that's what made it, I'm not going to say acceptable, because it's not necessarily acceptable, but it's something you would have never have heard of happening in the 50s and 60s, right? When facing, say, the Soviet Union, right? When there was sort of an opposition on the other side of the world, right? That did show that there was an other system that, perhaps one might say, even if people might say it was revisionist, etc., or with the PRC, it didn't make sense to making those calls to say that the elections had, etc., right, all these issues, and to deny, say, the results of them. Whereas now it's we live in an age where capitalism has completely, has no enemies, right? Definitely no geopolitical enemies, right? And so that's what makes that's what allows for more and more of these, like, oh, well, this was stolen or whatever, right? Whether it's true or not true, right? It doesn't really matter, right? It's like now that becomes a standard thing that like, again, because now the United States has done it, and the stability that the United States kind of as an imperialist hegemon has had historically, now means that it also affects other countries as well, right? Like now other countries can also have their what's it called, their reactionary. I was trying to think of a word that kind of like encapsulates it, but I think hello, welcome in, Peganox, welcome in. How are you doing? It's so nice to see you. Welcome in for the first time. Hope all is well. So now we're going to go into, let's see here. I'm good. Just got off Twitter. Yes, I saw what you were saying about the squirrel. Oh my gosh. That was so frustrating for sure. Because, like, personally, as someone from the global south myself, I am so used to people just, like, ignoring what, people from the global south have to say. And just, like, I'm not even going to listen to you or whatever. Let alone trying to, like, deep dive, find out about someone, so that then they can, like, impeach their ideas or something, right? Okay, so now we're going to go into, I'm Indigenous Canadian, so I divert to Arun and others for my knowledge on that area. Right, exactly. Like, that's one of those things that's like, like, I might be covering, like, right now, like, I just got done covering, like, the elections, right, in Pakistan. But I also know that I don't, like, I'm a historian, right? So it's like I have my areas of expertise and my own lived experience, but I always, will always defer to, right, an actual expert in, like Arun, right? Like that's the reason why I like watching his streams. Why I've, also spoken to him on my stream, right? Because, he knows his stuff and other people, right? So, yeah. So now we're going to go to...
Biden's economy is booming, at least on...
we're going to go to this person, this economics professor, who says that, whose title of the video is literally, turns out I can't know everything. Oh my gosh, who would have guessed it, right? Who would have thunk it? So this YouTuber economist is asking why, or is rather going to teach us why voters hate. Actually, I think I should change the title. I think I almost want to change the title to like, and ask it as a question. Economy. Oh my gosh. I know how to type without having to look at the... Okay, here we go.
Paper where the numbers show that its economy has been growing quite a bit faster than...
Oh, so, but first of all, if you've watched my stream, you know that, like, just because, there are graphs, it does not mean that, like, it's true. That's, like, one of my big things. And economics is one of those things where, because it presumes that there is such a thing as the rational individual and that they do things, right, like out of this rational self-interest, it really, really gets on my nerves when they And again, I have nothing necessarily against economics, right? Like, that's not what I'm even saying. I'm just saying, like, there needs to be more questioning, right? Like, there needs to be a complication of these things. Yes, this is the case. But GDP is not a good measurement of how the rest of the economy is doing. It really is not. It's a horrible measurement overall.
Comparable economies like Europe, the United Kingdom, and Japan. On top of that, unemployment is still extremely low, and inflation is now falling faster than ever. And yet...
So, okay, well, now I'm going to be pausing a lot on this, because, unemployment is low, but that is not taking into account people who have stopped looking for work. And that's a lot of people. Like, I can tell you right now, I live in a really Mexican neighborhood because I'm a Mexican myself. And there are a lot of people that are, that would otherwise be working right now, right? They are day laborers. And when times are good, they usually have lots of work. This is just something that, again, is of course just based on my own observations. Yeah, exactly. Or people who have to work 2 or 3. I mean, even whilst being a streamer, I've had to work 3 jobs. Like 3 jobs and be a streamer, right? Because I've had to adjunct to different places to make ends meet, right? Like the whole, let alone, like right now, like where it's hurting right here, quite a lot actually, but I'll be fine. It's not too bad, but I might just have to make sure that I, so unemployment being low also doesn't take into account the quality of life for people who are unemployed. Yeah, exactly. Like, that's the problem. Is this is the issue with the way in which these things are communicated, right? Like, as a historian, right, the fact that are seasonal workers counted as employed or unemployed? How are gig workers counted? The only thing that isn't counted is farm employment. So that's what seasonal is usually counted in statistics for economics, because there's lots of like seasonal farm work. But when it comes to like the general overarching unemployment numbers, from what I understand, it would count in gig like independent contractors, as they like to say, as well. Yeah. So, and yeah, the fact that like the quality of life, I mean, for one, I can tell you that from what we understand, we know that the quality of life has gone down, because there are other metrics that also show this, right? And there are also things like the fact that just because inflation goes down, right, doesn't mean that the companies that used inflation as a reason to raise their prices as an excuse, right, they used it as an excuse to then raise their prices. It doesn't mean that they lowered their prices. Right? Stuff is still expensive because the corporations chose to make it expensive. So again, if you're unemployed or you're adjuncting, right, if you're in a contractual job or a gig worker or something, your buck doesn't stretch as much as it used to. And even then, it does not stretch as much as it used to well before, you even started to work. So
recent surveys reveal that Americans are very negative about their economy, and especially the way that President Joe Biden handled it compared to President Donald Trump. So how is it possible that a seemingly booming economy could cost Joe Biden the election? Are people just imagining things, or is the economy...
I like how it's like, well, in relation to Trump, I mean, again, most people, I don't think... I mean, even asking that question, like, in relation to... I have to make... right? Right, Bidenomics? Exactly, yes. Have to make profit. Exactly. But, like, even putting it in reference to, like, well, how Trump handled it. I mean, do people even remember how Trump handled it? Because it wasn't, like... good. It was quite obvious that essentially, like, when Trump came into office, he was riding high off what Obama had done, right? Like, the gains from that time, because he was only in there 4 years, right? And like the beginning, that's where he was all like, oh, you know, we had the longest bull market ever, blah blah blah, great. Yeah, but that doesn't affect most. He also had like literally the pandemic, well, at least the beginning of it for sure, right, in the year 2020 and the beginning of 2021, right? So, well, they got those tux cats. Yes, that is my new brand, Tux Cats. Tax cuts for the wealthy. That's totally a good thing, right? I mean, you know, that's definitely what both parties that are totally not just the same people wearing different colored ties, trademarked, you know, are telling us. And Obama saved the stock market, which is good economy, I guess. Right, like it's like that's the thing, right? It's like the things that we're told is good for the economy is never like, oh, you know, actually good for the people that make the economy, right? Like the workers, right? Like more imperialism makes the number on Wall Street go up, right? In the New York Stock Exchange, it does not make those of us who live here. Do you want your bigotry capitalism or red and blue, regular or diet? Pretty much, yes. That is exactly how, yes, that is a very good way of putting it, right? It's like, do you want your, you know, same fast action figure comes with 3 different outfits? Pretty much. I mean, that's the reason why I say, do you want red fascism or blue fascism, right? It's like, that's really what you're asking for, right? It's like you know, in many ways, right? For sure.
Economy really not as good as it seems on paper? To answer these questions, I have been scouring the internet for convincing explanations from economists, and I've actually found 3 fascinating theories that could explain the difference between what the numbers say and how voters feel about the economy. Theories that range from increased inequality to increased media negativity to Republican states like Texas and Florida outperforming Democratic ones like California and New York. Theories that...
Oh my gosh. This is just... Okay. There was also something else that comes with this as well. I was reading in this study, hey, that's not fair. The blue action figure has more joints, so can do less and more poses, right? So with I was recently reading that a study came out that showed that even though crime by all metrics is going down sharply, people on average think that it's getting worse. Like, they don't believe that it's getting better, or, you know, that it's lowering. They think it's like going up, right? They're like, oh my gosh, there's more crime. Oh no, you're totally fine, Peganox. You're 1000% fine. Trust me. And when I was reading that, I thought, yeah, because literally, if you watch anything, even in the liberal media, right, or the like Democrat media, they're still like, you know, crime is everywhere, right? And like the example given yesterday by Irene, right, No Comment Chick, was that in vis-a-vis Sam Cedar, was that like people calling in because he lives in the city, right, in New York. And they're like, how can you go there? Like, aren't you mugged like 50,000 times a day? Right? Isn't literally like the subway like just endless, you know? Who knows? Who knows what people think happens on the subway? Local news farms so much content off of this. Oh, yeah, 1000%. Like in Orange County, they farm that so much where it's like, I swear, some person like dropping like some of their ice cream becomes like nuclear waste deposited in Irvine. You know, it's like, no, it's not. It's really not. It's just, you know, Jessica just dropped some ice cream. You don't need to like, you know. But it always becomes that, because there's almost like, because if they actually had to report on the issues that we would have to focus on in order to better society, then it would make everybody hate capitalism. That's the problem. problem then is that they're like, well, if we were to say, that wage theft, right, just wage theft, not even like overtime theft, etc., just wage theft alone counts for more theft as such, right, in numerical terms alone, than all of the different varieties, legal categories of theft, of criminal theft, right, that they have to imprison people, right, the average person, by so many, times in magnitude. Then people would wonder, well, then why is everything focused off like, oh, did you hear about this one person in this one store in this one town that they decided to just like, again, that is given outsized attention to? I mean, it's kind of the reason why as well, like, so many of the, like, so much reportage, right, that you used to have in news agencies now really only exist to do, like, wannabe crime solving, right? Like, that's kind of what they want to do. It's like, it's always like, how can we harass homeless people, right? Like, that's always that's like essentially what they're doing, right? Like, we wanted to figure out about the homeless epidemic, right? They don't actually ask the real questions. They just go harass people, right, that want to be left alone, right? That instead of helping them get housing, they're like, how do we, et cetera, et cetera. So that's always one of the big issues of like local news and like regional news and, let alone national news, right? And then the fact that, of course, you have the like spin, the different voices, right, in the, in the United States media. But I mean, even to a large extent, let's see here. There was a New York Times article in December 2023, I think, where they say that retailers didn't really lose all that money in 2022. In reality, they barely got 3% of their reported $80 billion damage. Wow. Wow, that's... But I almost feel like what's interesting is the fact that type of even though it's a New York Times article, which is a hello, Carla, welcome in. It's so good to see you. I feel like those are the types of stories, like, even though it's a paper of record, right? Let's see here. Oh, it's a retraction. Oh, that's even better. Oh, gosh. It said only half of the industries in which the merchandise was the result of organized theft. It was likely closer to 5%. That's a lot. I mean, again, like, so much of this is just like, if they cannot claim loss, right, on their taxes, right, so to speak, right, in order to get more tax cuts, etc. And there are people that will say, sweaty, that's not actually what they do. That is what they do. Just because they don't do it when they're doing their, taxes, doesn't mean that that's not what they do. That's what they do in their lobbying organizations. What do you, because some people will be like, oh, that's not what they do, like, at tax time. Yes, but they do it at other times. And, I will link to them different things. But it's just kind of hilarious that everyone's like, they don't actually do that. Yes, they do. They're always lobbying for more tax cuts. Trust me. If corporations had to pay the actual amount of tax that they should pay, literally, there's no reason why anyone making under $50 million a year, essentially, or that, has that as their net wealth, should ever have to pay taxes at this point. But, the chances of that ever happening are slim to none. If they aren't lobbying for tax cuts, they're figuring out how to do it. Right, exactly. And I mean, people think that it's just like them lobbying as a corporation, but they have, industry lobbies. And also, a lot of people don't, necessarily know this either, but your state lobbies to them. Your state lobbies the government. And your state has an interest in defending the bourgeoisie of your state, right? So anytime there's a corporation, I live in LA, okay? I live in California, so you know all of the bourgeoisie in my state. You know, right? They're always you know. So yes, so like it doesn't matter. Like they will do anything to not get out of it, and they will do it by saying, "Oh, it needs to be done for the good of California, for the good of San Francisco, for the good of whatever." It doesn't really matter. They find a way to do it, you know. I also love when people claim how X retailer closed shop because of crime and not because they have 5 shops in 2 miles of radius. Yes, like in downtown Chicago, or even like in LA. Like it's always done. Like they like to say that, like especially when something closes, like in East LA, which is the Mexican part of LA, you know, historically, and then South LA, which is typically the, you know, more African American Black part of LA, is that they like to do that as if there aren't, like, you know, 17 Stater brothers within 10 feet of each other, essentially, right? It's always like, oh, well, because of this, therefore this, right? It's an post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, technically. Not that I care really about that, but the past couple of days I've been having to like read about them again. I mean, I've already read over them a long time ago when I was doing my undergrad and stuff, and even in high school, but that was like 700 years ago. But yeah, it's always to lower their expenses. I mean, everything is always about lowering their overhead, right? Like that's always, everything is predicated on just that. How do I pay less money? How can I pay my workers less money, right? That's why and that's the reason why so many companies, I forget what percentage it is, but it's a very high number. And I wish I could remember what the stream or what the video was where they particularly say this, but they call it the Google's dead zone. And so what that is that Google will buy up all of these companies that are innovating, are making actual innovations, but they will buy it, so then that way those innovations never get to exist, right? That is the reason why people have often said, like, why isn't there more scientific progress, right, or technological progress? Why does it seem like it's kind of slowed down and things are more or less... Well, that's one of the reasons, is because, again, they will quite literally go out and make sure that things that could disrupt the market, right, don't. So, again, like the people that extol the free market are just lying straight to your face. What at the end of the day is the founders love to be bought and cashed out. Right, exactly. It's something like, I forget, it's quite a high number. I want to say it's like maybe 75, if not 80% of like most companies that survive, right? Because like most private businesses, like on their own, don't survive like the first year, and then even less so as time goes on. But they want to make just enough like startups, right? They want to make just enough money to then be bought out by someone else, right? Like that's their entire goal. It's not about, oh, I want to blah blah blah. It's like they might say stuff like that in interviews, right, when they're starting out, but that they know that they're lying. They know that what they want to do is be bought out by some corporation. Same thing with small businesses. Like they want to be bought out by a corporate, you know. And so 2 years from now they can release a shittier version of the same thing. Exactly. I mean, that's the reason why it's like now the like new iPhone has 2 cameras again, right? They added a third one, then they're like, now we're gonna go back to 2. It's like, okay, you know.
All have some pretty convincing evidence to back them up. But which theory has the most convincing evidence? Well, to answer that question, let's first review the key numbers which suggest that Biden's economy is booming. Specifically, we'll have a look at the 4 most commonly used indicators to reflect how well average Americans are doing economically speaking. Real GDP, which is GDP corrected for inflation, inflation itself, unemployment, and the average real wage, which is the average wage, again, corrected for inflation.
Maybe. I don't know. I've only seen the ad like in passing, so to speak. Maybe there are.
First, as you can see here, America's real...
But I just know that like when I was watching it, they didn't show the more expensive model. They only showed the 2-camera one, but maybe like I don't know if the ad had that.
GDP per person indeed looks relatively good when compared to other economies such as Europe, the United Kingdom, and Japan. Everyone was hit hard by the COVID pandemic lockdowns, but only America's economy recovered to the pre-COVID trend line, potentially due to the generous economic stimulus provided.
You know that thing you enjoyed? Well, we brought it back. It goes much slower, but it can make fart noises and smell like roses, and it's only $500. I mean, you'd be surprised how much, like, innovation is trying to sell you a worse product for more. Right? I don't know. I think it was because of the word fart. Yeah, that's which is weird, I guess. Twitch is,
First by Trump and then by Biden. Stimulus that likely gave businesses the confidence to...
I like how, because of the framing of this video, we have to pretend that, everything that happened whilst, Trump happened to be the president is because of him, right? Just because of him. When it's, it's not even $500. It's everything is an app. Yes, everything is. It's I remember back in the day when you could get, Microsoft Word and, essentially what is now Microsoft Office or whatever, or, those things, right? And it's you just bought it. That was it. You had it forever. Or Adobe, Photoshop, whatever, right? So many of those things are now all becoming monthly subscriptions, And it's funny because I was thinking about going over the Yanis Varoufakis. The $500 is just to get the item. To keep it working is $15.99 a month. Yeah, I mean that's quite real. Of the whole thing where Yanis Varoufakis, he tries to argue the whole techno-feudalism thing, and I've always, as someone again who themselves works with, history, and also, as a cultural historian, I have to work with, economic history among other things. It's another one of those things, those terms that people like to use, particularly liberals like to use, as a way to not just say that that don't want to say imperialism, essentially. That's kind of a way of saying that. I don't want to say X is fake economy and Y is not, but deindustrialization really destroyed the world. I mean, today people who make web apps are rich. I mean, not industrial conglomerate. I guess the way to also think of that is that just how banking capital, right, or however you might term that, right, and industrial capital, right, became finance capital, right? Now you have digital capital, one might say, also being added into that, right? So because it's it still requires industrial production, just in the imperialized world, right? So
quickly rehire everyone that lost their job when the pandemic began, meaning that after a big spike, unemployment is again at an all-time low. However, there was also a dark side to this recovery: unprecedented inflation, making life much more expensive for ordinary Americans. Sure, many of these price increases were caused by pandemic-related supply chain disruptions and later the war in Ukraine. However, most economists agree that without generous stimulus measures, the massive inflation spike that you see here would likely not have happened, or at least...
Oh my gosh, they love to say this, but that's the difference between new and old money. I mean, yeah, for sure. What the likelihood for their name to be spread around? Yeah, for sure. We no longer think of, Rockefeller is not a name that we think about all the time, right? We don't think of Standard Oil, but people do think of Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan, if mainly because the fact that they are Wall Street, among with Merrill Lynch and et cetera, right? but they're still connected, right? Like that's kind of why there was a book, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was something like the subtitle was How Asset Managers Rule the World, which is, it's just a provocative subtitle, but it's like essentially talking about how like the way of conceptualizing like contemporary capitalism as like it's either like before, right, there was banking capital and industrial capital, and now because everything's so integrated into one another because of finance capital in the late 19th and early 20th century, that became even more so, right? And this is where I think Marx's description of things like fictitious capital, right, really come into play, right? Sort of demonstrate how like the idea of asset managers, right, like people that invest as opposed, and obviously Lenin's discussion of a rentier society sort of go in hand with discussing this too, right? There are entire families that just are sitting on hoards of wealth that are more or less hiding in plain sight. Oh yeah, like most of the wealthiest people, most of the wealthiest people in the world, you will never know their name, so to speak, right? Like it's like the same thing like when they make like the Forbes list or whatever. It's like most of the people, they're like, who megalo, right? Like that's most of the thing. Activist investors like Bill Ackman and Larry Fink, let alone others, because it's like they have no problem with activist investors, right? Unless they can somehow wrap them into a conspiracy theory, right? Like, oh, well, because like literally George Soros is one of the most boring people. Like I have like of all the capitalists, like literally so boring. Like he's just there. You know what I mean? Like, like, like I don't know. Like I've read his books and it's just like, okay. Like he did what every like investor like him is like what's his name? The guy that was in The Big Short. Oh God, I should know his name, because everybody loves to invoke his name, because he, all of his predictions, right? That he, hello, Boy Meets Minnie. Okay, thank you for lurking. What's his name? But like, people keep Michael Berry. Thank you so much. Yeah, Michael Berry. Like, people love to bring up his predictions of what's going to happen. He got everything wrong and just happened to get like what happened with the housing crisis correct, right? It's like Berry, right? Because he kept getting tons and tons and tons of things incorrect, but then because he got that correct, then everyone's like, oh, he knows everything now. And so people keeps like, there are so many things that like last year and the year before that all these like financial YouTubers, I guess, I honestly cannot describe to you just how somewhat obnoxious a lot of these YouTubers are, because rather I'm talking about the ones that try to say that like Michael Burry is like a messiah, right? Right, that he's some kind of like like the oracle at Delphi, but in this case the oracle of I don't know, of Palo. Well, I don't want to say Palo Alto because that actually sounds like the title of one of those books that Bloomsburg publishes, right? Like the Oracle of Silicon Valley or whatever. But it's essentially the same aspect. Where like they keep attributing to him like, oh, Michael said that like China, it's just like, what? Okay, good to know. I'm glad that you're like, 'cause I'm glad that someone is keeping up with Michael these days. But it's like people like, like he does what he was supposed to do, I guess. What I like about Soros is not he tries not to be a cool guy like Elon or pick any modern CEO, right? I mean, he's literally like, you know what, I'll just let my kid, be the investor now. Literally, like, you can read his book, The Alchemy of Finance, and he's literally like, I like to spend time with my kids. I love spending time with my grandkids most of all. Blah, blah, blah. It's just like, he's literally like talking about like, I like to take my kids to the lake. Like he's just a regular person.
Reversed more quickly afterwards. And while the GDP numbers still look good when corrected for inflation, the same can really not be said for real average wages, which, as you can see here, have only recently returned to their pre-pandemic trend, as inflation is now falling. But okay, before we get into this drop of real wages here, we need to talk about something strange. You see, this bump over here, it means average real wages went up at the start of the pandemic. But why? Well, we can actually see this bump because at the start of the pandemic, many vulnerable people lost their jobs. And with a lot of vulnerable people who don't earn that much, out of a job, the average wage actually went up. Because it.
So you see, right? Like, so this is one of those things, right? Like, so what he just described, right, what Yuri just described, is something that, again, is very important when reading these statistics. Because people will say, oh, look, the average wage has blah, blah, blah gone up. Again, as he himself said, as the Federal Reserve Economic Data, or FRED, shows, is that if you had a whole bunch of people, say, in the service sector, right, lose their jobs, but people in the tech, let's just say, right, that have, say, very high salaries, right, or pardon me, very high wages, let's say, then that will make that figure go up. So it will look as though the average wage has gone up, right? Because in terms of like the amount of numbers in that set is higher, but it doesn't reflect the fact that there are people that now, right, like the amount of zeros, people not getting any wages now doesn't really go into that. So to speak. But also, again, like it doesn't take into account many other things. So that's why, like, when you're looking at this stuff from like the lay person's point of view, but even from, say, like an academic point of view, is to keep in mind that so many of these things are, do not take into account, right, or rather are based on the idea of like who is left in the economy. Right, so if CEOs, right, that pay themselves, really high salaries, and middle management and upper management, right, that get high wages, if they're the only people more or less that are left in a company, the average wage of a company seems like it's much higher than it actually is. It's obviously not going to last long as a company if it's like almost completely top heavy, but again, that's how we have to understand this data, right? Like that's why the reason that the unemployment rate does not take into account all the people that are actually unemployed is because then it would be really high. If it actually took into account everybody that is no longer searching for a job because of they can just not find one, because it's actually very difficult to find a job. Like I remember even when I lived in another part of LA, right? Like in another general area of LA County. I remember at the very, 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 very start of the pandemic, there was a trend of, quote, left-wing billionaires you never heard of. Those accounts are mostly quiet now. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, like it's interesting to me how like so many of those like supposed right left-wing billionaires just like completely went full. I mean, many of the people that at least are kind of align with like what I'm not saying necessarily that we're talking about the same group of people, but those that kind of like align themselves with the idea that there are like good billionaires, right? Good capitalists and bad capitalists, and what we need to do is like let the good capitalist have total control of everything, not the bad capitalist, right, in total control, and then we'll have, like a human rights paradise, right? As kind of like the Democratic Party tries to sell us in the United States. That's kind of like the whole thing, right? It's like now they're saying like, actually, it doesn't matter that Biden wanted to pass, literally is running concentration camps on the border, let alone is, doing what the horror of Gaza, right? Enabling it even more and more and more and more, to the point where it is literally beyond belief. Like, it's literally gone to a point. I don't doubt that there are good people that happen to be capitalists, right? Yeah, as such, yeah. Yeah, like, as such, yeah, for sure. But it's not because they're capitalists. That's that they're good people, right? Like, that is them, right, not letting their class position and the class interests, right, come before what they're doing. Because, in effect, what that will cause that's the reason why, like, the petit bourgeoisie, right, why it's so reactionary, is because it's always on the verge of being proletarianized, right? And so that's the reason why it's always reactionary against the working classes, right? And of course, you have race, patriarchy. It's all those things thrown into the mix, and you also get that as well, right? You have these other avenues of marginalization and of oppression of peoples, right? That then allows for certain aspects, certain parts of the working classes to be, harmed at the expense of, That's why, like, people that put an emphasis on the white working class, that doesn't really do anything for the working classes, right? Because, again, if you're not there for the most marginalized, then the people that are essentially the most privileged, even within the working classes, because of those different intersections of marginalization, then there's a huge problem. But but yes, like that's one of the things too, right?
Only reflected the wage of these high income earners. But then, as the more vulnerable people were hired back quite quickly, the average real wage dropped again. So yeah, this bump at the start of the pandemic is pretty meaningless for judging how well the economy was doing at the time. And for now, I think it's best to just ignore it and just focus on this drop over here, which makes clear that, when everybody was hired back, most working Americans saw the spending power of their wages drop during Biden's tenure because their wage growth, which did grow, did not keep up with inflation. So if we look at the metrics, we can see that America's economy definitely took a big hit from the pandemic. First, GDP dropped massively while unemployment rose, but then as stimulus kicked in, GDP and unemployment recovered. However, then inflation spiked.
See, this is the thing about focusing in on stimulus, is because they never focus. They focus on, we gave, the average person, right, stimulus money, which we know actually did help the economy. Right, because that actually gave people the ability to purchase things that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to, let alone the, rent moratoriums, right, the eviction moratoriums, etc. But they never criticized the far larger things of the PPP loans or whatever they are, right? Like, that were just far out, right? They were like millions and millions of dollars, right? Most of them were, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like, they never care about that, even when they were absolved. But yet, if people talk about the absolution of student debt, you won't hear the end of it. Like, it's going to crash the economy. Like, all of this nonsense. But if it's tax cuts, if it's whatever, right? It's like, how dare you speak against tax cuts against the capitalists? Don't you know that they are the best of our nation? Like, it's just ridiculous. Just ridiculous how they, like, this is why, again, like, economics as one of the social sciences in the Western world tends to be by far one of them, of all of them, tends to be one where lots of right-leaning people can and are in. I'm super vocal about indigenous issues. Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. As I am, because I know as a white passing indigenous person, sometimes more likely to listen, someone's more likely to listen to myself over my cousins who, quote, present more indigenous, end quote. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like, it's definitely important to always stand up for the most marginalized, and especially to use, right, like, any, like, this is where the idea, and I don't want to get too in depth on it, but like just sort of like building on that, right? This is where the idea of like an ally and an accomplice, right? Again, I don't necessarily like that terminology, but this is a terminology that has been used, right? As that like an ally is someone that's like, I tolerate, tolerance is kind of like the lower sense, but like acceptance, right? Where you will physically, use the privileges you do have in society so that then, right, people that are not privileged, people that are marginalized can have their voices, heard, or have their, be there with their actions so that they are not as heavily, whatever it might be, right? So then that way they can, sort of say what they want to say and be listened to, right? Because exactly, Peganux, like so much of this, and I'm not even joking, is literally like, it would be okay to say what X person, like say here, like in the, in LA, right? It's like, if you're Mexican, they'll say, well, if I say this is wrong, right? Yeah, sure, they'll listen to me, but they won't take it seriously unless a white person says it, right? Like, all the time, even when I was little, even in, all the time, it's like, you're Mexican, right? Like, people will listen, like, even if they do listen, right? It will only be to a certain amount, but if a white person says it, then it's, very, very different. Playing a Souls-like game called Steel Rising. Ooh, it sounds nice. Steel Rising. It doesn't have the great reviews, but I'm enjoying it. Yeah, that's always one of those things too, where like there are books and even films that are like don't have good reviews. Like one of the films that I recognize because a lot of people don't like, say, art house films, right? They like, if they are given like a general audience rating, they tend to be like not rated very well. But if they are, if it's more like if it's something that, say, same thing with foreign films, right? Like it's, if you're like, a lot of people don't like foreign films in the United States simply because, and I'm not even joking, because then they have to read subtitles, which is just like, because that was a poll that they did like 3 years ago. If I don't know if anybody could find it, but I forget who published it. I want to say it was on the Huffington Post, but it doesn't really matter. But yeah, but yes, like I often have things like that where like things that aren't necessarily like really highly rated, I still like anyway. The story is basically the French aristocracy wasn't wiped out because of a bourgeois aristocracy exploiting its people. No, it was because King Louis unleashed an army of robots. Oh my gosh, that is hilarious. So then, like, what does King Louis the 16th become then? Unfortunately, the reality is, if you want to get a certain type of person's attention, you seem to need a white cis girl to speak up about it. Right. At least it seems right. Like, I mean, as the saying goes, right? A white girl with good teeth, right? Like, that's something that, I hear lots of BIPOC and, that I know of here in LA say quite a lot. Like, unless, that happens, like, you're never going to get, the problem you want resolved or whatever. And I mean, sometimes it's even something like as simple as, if, for example, like being Latinx, if people, and I've mentioned this before, like, it doesn't matter the fact that I'm, multilingual, right? That I'm a polyglot. I could speak 1,000 different languages, but people, the way I've been treated, it's like white people will think that I am unintelligent, I'll put it like that, as soon as they find out that I speak Spanish, which you would think would make sense, but it's unbelievable how, like, oh, you speak Spanish, suddenly everything I say can be discounted now. So it's this very strange relationship as well with that too, right? Just met Robespierre during a time when he should have been, Robespierre. Oh my gosh, yeah, I love that too. By the way, if you'd like to help me in some way, I know I recently said I was in a car accident, and there are ways to do so on my Linktree. I have it pinned. It's also now in chat. You can donate something there if you would like to. Otherwise, you can always support my research by going to my Throne, sponsoring a book, as my Throne just popped up as well. You can always do that. I'm currently trying to get In the Shadow of Race on Jews and Latines, right, when it comes to immigration policy. But yes, if you would like to help me in some way, please do so. Please make sure to follow, and if you would like to subscribe. And yeah.
Spiked so much that actually for a long time the average wage corrected for inflation fell and it only recently recovered. And while that looks bad, it can always be worse as real wages continued to fall in 2023 for Europe, the United Kingdom and Japan. So then why are Americans just as negative as, for example, Europeans about the state of their economy? Well,
thank you.
There are many explanations circulating online. I only found 3 that could be supported by at least somewhat convincing evidence. Of these, Biden's favorite explanation is that you are being misinformed by the media. But before getting into that, let's talk about data.
Oh gosh, I don't want to. It's funny. I have had Twitch Turbo in the past. I didn't even know that it did that.
This time it's not Trump.
Someone Twitch Turbo is something everyone should invest if they use Twitch a lot. I do use Twitch a lot. But just like recently, the good kind of Turbo. Right, exactly. Yeah. No, I was just like when it came to renew, I kind of was like, I need to save every penny because of, paying for the stuff.
That is
like the medicine in particular.
Out
after my car accident.
Biden, who said that the media is not properly reporting about the state of the economy. And let's be honest, it is true that especially on social media, like here on YouTube, for example, videos about the collapse of the American economy were trending in 2023, even as the economy recovered from a global pandemic shutdown. Therefore,
okay, so that guy, Graham, oh gosh, he's one of those that's like always talking about how like Elon is absolutely changing everything about the world. All you got to do, and like they actually were part of this scandal. I want to say they were sued for like $1 billion. Yeah, I think it was $1 billion. CoffeeZilla, maybe we'll go into it later. They actually did a lawsuit where they scammed people out of money because and this was with the FTX scandal, right? Where they kept telling them that like this FTX is separate from this FTX, but actually that wasn't the case. So, Graham Stephen, just, buyer beware. Also, I'm sorry, any person that's like, oh, by the way, whilst I was still in high school, I was able to invest tens of thousands of dollars out of nowhere. I don't know. For them to give advice to people that don't have money to invest, I like CoffeeZilla. The last time I was still living, or I was living for a time in Mexico City, I actually started watching him. So this was years ago, and I found a lot of his stuff to be really interesting. I just, there was just a lot that I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that so many red flags everywhere. But like for me, like crypto, for when I just read about it, I was like, oh no, this is just bad. Like, I will never get why so many crypto enthusiasts in his own server. Yeah. Well, I would find that strange too, since like, again, in my opinion, crypto is not something you want to get involved in, but that's just my opinion. Bro, I wish I had 1K or 10K. Yeah. No, but he's like, oh yeah, like, look at me. I have 5 Ferraris. It's like that. And it's just like, okay, so you are already rich. And look, it's, yes, people that are not necessarily very wealthy can go into real estate and make money off of that. But the chances of you making yourself successful, right, in your early 20s, pretty much, to the tune of like millions of dollars off of real estate alone is very improbable. Like, you don't do the type of real estate sales he was doing if you don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's quite, like, just by looking at even the stuff he's willing to disclose, right, that he kind of has to disclose, right? Real estate alone is improbable, exactly. Because if you ever go to California City, which is just like a whole bunch of nothingness in the desert, you'll know exactly what Anita means. FTX was always going to be a scam. Yeah, pretty much. Have you ever gone there, Anita? Oh my gosh. He's a capitalist for sure. Yeah. I also wasn't too much of a fan of when, there was like he had like a podcast with one of his friends, and they, there's just stuff, just some issues. You just got off work. Oh, nice. It's California's second largest city that ended up not getting built. Correct. Yes, that's correct. I was going to be like out in the middle of the desert, and
Some started to say that 2023 was not the year of an economic recession, but rather the year of a vibe session in which just the vibes were really...
Oh my god, who came up with this? Oh my gosh. Who came up with this? I need to know. Kevin Dugan. Obviously, the spawn of Alexander, I mean, he identifies as a capitalist. Well, yeah, tons of like libertarians. I know, right? Vibe session. Deceased. I know. It's like, yes, a vibe session, as as the sacred texts speak about. Like that to me, that like he already gave me like super libertarian vibes. I will say that. Saying vibes, right? Definitely comes off in that way already. But that's what a lot of like, just now seeing that. Yeah, I know. Contrary to belief, you're not really a capitalist unless you have capital in some sector. I know that he has investments. He's mentioned that before. Like, I know that he has like, and I think that he owns. I mean, again, he's petite bourgeoisie at best, right? Like, he's definitely not bourgeoisie. He's petite bourgeoisie.
Bad, but why were the vibes in the media so bad? Well, here many have pointed out that the cause could be something called negativity bias, which means that when given the choice, people tend to watch negative news stories more often than positive ones. But are Americans more exposed to negative news than, for example, Europeans? Well, yes, that is likely for two reasons. The first is that Americans, on average, rely more on social media for their news, which is extremely competitive, and therefore...
Okay, I mean, yes, but people do use social media more. But at one point in time, you could find people with a little symbol next to their name on this website. It's really ancient and apparently doesn't exist anymore. There's no record of it at all. It was called something like Twitter, I think. In fact, we have lost the knowledge of how to pronounce it, so we're not really sure because it was written in cuneiform. And that is, of course, that you could tell whether someone was, telling you real information. You call it Twix. It's like, but that's one of the issues that we've had. You could find reliable information. And especially if you wanted to get information from various places, such as myself, you could find, right, verifiable information. But now, because literally anybody and just literally anybody can buy that little symbol, yeah.
Creators are more likely to exploit your negativity bias to get views.
Oh my gosh, I hate... Okay, in my lifetime, people have said like, oh, in 1987, China will, like every single year, people say China's going to 2001, China's going to 2005, China's going to, like, they keep doing this. It's like, okay, at this point, China's immortal. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they've said it's going to, like, just, it's like, you know what I mean? Like I've been hearing it for so long. And the thing is that it's not even just random, crypto dudes on the internet that like love Elon like way too much, and to think that he like wrote the First Amendment himself. It's literally like The Economist, right? Which we all know what Lenin said about The Economist. I mean, like our boy Lenin, he could definitely throw some shade. That's for sure. Okay, but at the same time, like, not only was he wholly accurate in that, it's like, it's so weird to just see it. It's so long in my entire life and still be like, oh, tomorrow it's going to collapse. It's doing fine, like.
Second reason is that even if you just look at traditional media, Americans are more likely to be confronted with sensationalized negative news as their media landscape is much more commercialized. But
it's much more commercialized. I mean, that's one way of putting it. I mean, yes, it's in their interest to, literally either lie straight up or to, say things in such a way that people can't quite tell that it's a lie or not, and sensationalize something by, focusing on crime or, stuff that, other stuff that's, literally not an issue as they portray.
is this really why people were so negative about Biden's booming economy? Well, recent research by economists does show that media sentiment about the economy has gotten significantly worse over the past 50 years, even as the economy kept growing.
But what has happened in the past 50 years, economically, say, systemically, right? Like, if we were to say about the type of economy that we have, right, that has, I don't know, maybe caused that sentiment. Because last time I checked, 50 years ago, there was no, I don't know, Instagram. Like, last time I checked, I don't remember. Nothing happened. Everything's fine. Exactly, right? Like I just cannot remember, like, let's see, 50 years ago, right? Let's literally count it back on our hands, right? So let's go 2014, 2004, 1994, 1984, 1974. So just going back to 1974, right? If you see a lot of graphs around this time, there's usually a decoupling that happens, right? Which is real wage growth, right? Which usually goes down. And also like the amount of, and productivity, right? Like the wages as they grow and the productivity of people. Productivity shoots up for the past 50 years. We are more productive now than we've ever been in all of history for all we know. And yet the remuneration that we get is lower than ever. At least for the working classes. And so what that means is that something happened in those years that we're talking about that changed that especially. Now, what might that be? Well, there was this man who apparently, Ben Shapiro, like, kind of like Pallas Athena, just like sprouted out of the like forehead of, because he literally like, and again, say what you want about Ben Shapiro, but actually, you know what? I'll stop at that. Say what you want about Ben Shapiro. Period. That's just a declarative statement right there. Say whatever the fuck you want about him. But anyway, like, he loves Milton Friedman, like, way too much, right? Like, way, way, way too much. But Milton Friedman, at around this time, was writing a lot of his seminal essays, right? And one thing is that's when you really begin to see neoliberalism take effect, right? That's when you see he's a dork and needs to be, well, yeah, for sure. I mean, he needs to go to like an actual high school, right? Like, he needs to, like, you know what I mean? Like, he, like, yeah. He needs to go to an actual high school. He never got the real experience. So anyway, this is at a time when you begin to have the decoupling of these things because of the financialization of the U.S. economy in particular, right? This is when things like, right, and this happened under Nixon technically, right, where you have the end of the Bretton Woods system, right? This happened again before. But this is when you begin to see things. Ben needs the locker treatment. You know, it's good for the skin. You know what I mean? It's really good for the skin. You know, they have like aloe and like, you know, seaweed wrap. You know what I mean? Like it's really good for the skin. So, you know, it builds character. That's for sure. You know, it builds character in everybody that's ever gotten locker treatment. You know. You know, so because of this, right, because of this shift in the way in which the economy sort of functions, it essentially means that, and this is something that Powerful Finger mentioned earlier, right, like deindustrialization. This is when this really begins to happen on a larger scale in the United States, where the imperialism that we kind of know as our kind of normal, right, for, you know, pretty much everybody that's here, we begin to move away from a Fordist economy, which is the one in particular that sort of focused on, say, the nuclear family, and, you know, very much so, right? As we know from why when people think of like the 30s and the 20s, they always focus on the nuclear family, and not like how the family has changed over the centuries. Excuse me. And also was required industrial production, required a high level of employment, if not total employment, definitely as much as possible, to now the neoliberal system, right, as we kind of know it, right? This is when you begin to have things like, and this really, you know, people kind of know this under Reagan, right, where you begin to have the financialization of the entire economy, the moving of productive sectors of the economy, right, away from, right, you have outsourcing, right, which is just imperialism, right? Yes, you prioritize short-term gains over long-term economic health, you're going to get to a stagnation, then a hard crash, or 8. Right. The old guard of capitalists at least understood that. Right, and that is one of the things that kind of like the golden age of capitalism, as it's often called, is from often described as 1945 to 1965. So we're in the aftermath of that. And 1973 is when there is the oil embargo, right, that has Paul Volcker pull a Paul Volcker, right, which is literally what the Federal Reserve did last year in 2023, which is raise interest rates, right? And this is orthodox economics. This is the standard version of economics as it's taught, you know, in the economics classroom in a university, is that in order to have fiscal health, right, in order for the economy to function in a way that's, you know, good, quote unquote, is that you have to pull a Paul Volcker in times of inflation, which means that you raise interest rates until you cause a recession, right? That's what Paul Volcker did in 73. Why? Now you might be like, why would they do that? Well, one, you know, like crashes are good for capitalism. I mean, maybe not for for capitalists for sure, like, you know, for the monopolies, right? Because then they can buy up stuff that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. Because, you know, capitalists don't actually want competition. They like to say that, but they don't actually want that. They only use that as an excuse, right? Because they think that, you know, because liberals kind of buy into that, right? They're like, oh yeah, of course, you know, because like, you know, anyway. So what Paul Volcker did was, again, raise the interest rates until they caused a recession. Now, why is this the case? Because a recession means that inflation by definition goes away, right? It is a deflationary period, right? So what the Federal Reserve was doing by raising the interest rates is trying to pull a Paul Volcker, right? Raise it so much that enough people lose their jobs, that enough people, like, they wanted that to happen. That's the reason why this idea that it's vibes, that it's a vibe session, right, so to speak, etc. That's one of those aspects where, like, if we look at central banking and how it actually functions in terms of economic policy, one of those things is they think that they know what's best for everybody. That includes, again, causing the immiseration of millions of people for the sake of line go up, right? So that is in essence what we're talking about here, right? Like, the reason why we've been seeing it become particularly worse is because in the past 50 years, we've had two not two vibe sessions, but two recessions caused by the same mechanism, by the raising of interest rates, pardon me, so that then people can become unemployed, so that then there can be deflationary periods, right? So again, that's what we need to remember. Like, every time people say, oh, it's the stimulus checks, that's what caused it. That isn't true. That isn't true, because so much of what was reported as inflation, especially early on, was literally corporations raising their prices using inflation as their excuse, right? So whenever I hear the term vibe session, I feel my brain short circuit. I know, it's just...
However, as you can see from the red line over here, when Trump was president, economic news also got way more negative. But at the same time, the economic sentiment measured in an influential survey by the University of Michigan, which is the blue line, well, this remained much more positive. So I don't think negative news stories can fully explain the vibe session under Biden, which brings us to the second theory, which states that it's not only that the US media is exceptionally competitive and therefore negative, it is also uniquely polarized politically. And strangely enough, the University of Michigan survey shows that the implications of this political polarization are very important for how people feel about the economy. For example, as you can see here, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, Republicans were suddenly really optimistic about the economy, while Democrats all of a sudden thought that the economy was in terrible shape. Similarly, when Biden was elected...
So essentially what this is saying is like, oh, hey, red tie bad for blue tie enjoyers, blue tie bad for red tie enjoyers. Like, that's essentially what this is saying. Like, well, because red tie man in charge, red tie man is in charge, therefore everything is bad, right? Like, but they did you understand.
In 2020, Republicans all of a sudden thought that the economy was going down the drain, while Democrats thought that it was doing great. Of course, that fact alone cannot explain why Biden's economy is so much more unpopular than that of Trump. After all, given that both parties are roughly equally popular, on average, how people feel about the economy...
Are they? I don't know. Like, I'm sorry, like, I met so many people. Like, even people that are, like, pretty, like, I knew as being quite liberal, being like, I don't know about this Biden guy, like...
would not change that much if there is a new president. Sure, under Biden, Republicans hate the economy, but that was always going to happen. However, surprisingly, Democrats are also relatively pessimistic about the economy right now. That is Biden's real problem. But why are Democrats so negative about Biden's booming economy? Could it be that for them, it is not really booming that much? Well, if you look at America's economy state by state and then hold that next to a map of voting patterns, you can see that it's actually mostly the...
Oh gosh, I really dislike when they well, if we look at these things in these parts of these states where dirt gets to vote, then, this is like some, red and blue only science, right? That's like, well, because again, if you look at where most people live, where most economic activity happens, it's mostly blue, right? It's only if you look at it in with this map as a state that then you see it as this, right? So yeah, they do that shit. Yeah, in Canada, I mean, in Mexico it's slightly different because we have multiple parties, and well, I shouldn't put it that way. People do that in Mexico where they will show this, but it's not as much of a thing because so many elections, or at least the most, ever since the dictatorship ended, every thing has been like a coalition pretty much, right? Like the Green Party, the Workers' Party, blah blah, like those parties tend to join with whatever's the most like progressive party in, you know, whatever government is running at the time. Like the current government, that's Morena, right? That's the Movimiento de Renovación Nacional, right? The party of national like renovation, I guess. They are a party that won for the first time the presidency, the election that happened 6 years ago, and this year they're going to have their second election, right? So yeah. Why does the North always vote this way? Bruh, there's like 400 people that know to vote up there. Everyone else is indigenous and cannot go to a poll because they're poverty, even if they wanted to. Right. I mean, it's the same thing, right? It's like when they, like, again, this does happen in Mexico. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying it's a bit more complicated because like all of the smaller parties get counted in too, because coalitions are just a much bigger thing in Mexico. And so one of those things is like, for example, you see a lot of like really small like third party, as they might be called, or multiple party, right, ads in Mexico that you don't really see in the United States. Like you might see like not really the Libertarian Party. Oh no, yeah, no, I totally get you. But like, yeah, like in the states where indigenous people in Mexico make up the majority of the population, those states also have a much more marginalized population, but they also tend to have populations that don't vote as much because of that marginalization. Because the areas which indigenous, for example, like I was talking about the Afro-Mexican population, they didn't have a road that went to La Costa Chica until the 90s. And really, they didn't have one until the 2000s. Like they had a road as, you know, like something that connected them to essentially the rest of the world, right, in the 90s. But they didn't have it like, you know, kind of how we think of a road until the 2000s. So that area of Guerrero, where you have, you know, the highest population of Black Mexicans, right? They never really participated in government, in voting, because they literally didn't even have a road to go, you know, or Black Brazilians, even in the face of an effective politician like Lula, right? Yeah, there's even a good quote of a book that I read that's called Capitalism or Fascist. No. I forget what it's called, but it's essentially like tries to really analyze, right, the fact that like Lula isn't as, we shouldn't give Lula too much praise, right? Why would people who have been let down by politicians of all stripes want to vote? Right, exactly, right. Like same thing. Like where like the city I'm from is right on the border, right? Like with the United States, and the places where like my grandparents lived, etc. You don't really find many political people, right? Like because of the fact that, you know, they just see everybody as corrupt. They just want to take your money. They just want to, in the same way that like nobody likes the cops, right? Because they just come up and say, "Oh, will you donate to us?" You know, it's like, you know, so yeah. So I mean, you know, that's the reason why, like, and when there are people that try to make, you know, some change in the community, you know, especially during the dictatorship, they made sure that those people, you know, did not. Yeah. In Cuba, yeah, I mean, yeah, that too, right? Like, the belief that all of the contradictions are somehow solved, you know, day one after the revolution is over. In my view, the revolution is never truly over, right? In one sense, right? But, you know, in that point, right, when you're like building, yeah, the term, oh my gosh, oh yeah, that is just, I mean, like even in the United States, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs is just like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like that's just like, I don't know. It's just always rubbed me the wrong way. But it comes from that line of thinking. Yeah, exactly. Like it's very similar with when it comes to like it's kind of the way how they used to use the term indigenous as a way to deny Afro-Mexicans their own protections and rights as a marginalized people. I'm not even joking. Like yes, the 1917 Mexican Constitution, very progressive, but with the implementation of it, it was always, the benefit was always more felt in the most, wealthiest parts of the country, right? As tends to be, right? The whitest part of the countries too. I get those calls too many times. Every time I want to tear on you and tell them, yeah, I know. In Mexico, like they actually, back in the day, I don't know if they do this now, but they would like knock on your door and be like, oh, do you want to donate to like, this whatever? And we would, my family would just always be like, just don't even, just get quiet, just be quiet. Just pretend like nobody's home. So, and like nobody on my block would really ever donate either. So, because it was always like the same two cops and we were just like, nobody liked them. So, yeah.
Red state economies that are darker on the economic growth map, meaning that they are the ones who have been booming. But why are red Republican states doing so much better than blue Democratic states? Well, one plausible explanation that has been put forward by economist Noah Smith is that highly restrictive zoning regulations are making it all but impossible to build new houses and factories in blue states. This is contributing to unaffordable housing, which then leads to increased homelessness and migration from blue states to red states.
This is just wrong on one hand, because do you know the fact that one, it's not as though homelessness does not exist in red states and that it's going down. It's actually going up in red states, right? It's going up everywhere, right? Like, but people love to focus on like downtown, like essentially like the central part of San Francisco, right? Like downtown San Francisco, like in the city. Same thing with like Skid Row here in LA, etc. They hyper focus on those parts, but California still accounts for, what is it, like 80% of food production in the United States? Some vast number like that. Because everything else that's done elsewhere in the country, if they do have, industrial farming, of course, is done to like feed cattle or to, for other things, not actually for people to eat, food. Particularly it's like fruit production and, et cetera, et cetera. So, and not only that, but it's also like, if California were its own country, it would be like the fifth largest economy, whatever, right? Like not to necessarily, California, but it's like putting it in this way makes it seem as though like people are leaving California, truly for those reasons, right? Like for purely, Texas can build factories, so I'm going to move to Texas, right? Like, no. In fact, lots of homeless people, right, or unhoused people, as I prefer to say, actually move to California, right? Like, if they can, this is where many people try to find a way to get to California. Because one of the things, let's not forget that most of the wealth gained by red states are due to what people buy in big city blue places. Right. I mean, like, if it wasn't for New York, they would, like, the inverse is also true. Right. For sure. Like, I think trying to separate the two, right, in this weird way that the United States likes to pretend that, like, one could be independent without the other, right? Like, oh yeah, for sure. Like if it wasn't for the farming and the cattle raising in particular, right? Like essentially the meat production, right? Considering how much the United States eats a lot of, meat, right? If it wasn't for that, right? Like that would be an enormous thing that the largest cities in the country, which tend to be in what are called blue states, right? Wouldn't have. So there's that. Among many other things, but it's like this weird desire to like pretend that somehow they could decouple, right? that like, oh, well, if the red states were to go away, right? And this is what I think also fuels this idea that like there is such a thing, right, as like or like the whole like Civil War discourse, which is just ridiculous, is again, it's not realistic because, well, fascist violence is one thing, but a civil war, like as people imagine it to be, is definitely not. Because again, this idea that you could like randomly slice up the country on these, using these maps would not actually work the way that people think it does. Like 90 plus percent of people live within major conurbations of the United States, right? Like, that is to say, people in the United States, mostly 90% plus, live within the suburbs, right? The city, suburbs, or exurbs of major cities. So, like, this idea of like, oh, the farm, the blah blah blah, the actual number is very, very low, and that is especially in proportion to the population. So, again, and that number isn't getting larger, right? You might see a lot of people, right, like preppers that are buying land, but they still want to live a petit bourgeois lifestyle, right? Because they buy ATVs, they buy, huge, refrigerators and, industrial freezers, whatever, right? It's like a real person that's like tied to the land and everything, they can't afford stuff like that, right? That's not something an actual farmer can afford. Right, and then there are, let alone the like other farmers, right? The industrial farmers, the owners of the capital, right? So yes, like the decoupling is what's always stood out as an issue for me. Like everything is integrated into each other, right? And so that is one of those things that has always seemed to me to be very important to highlight and stress, for sure.
Ironically, it also means that Biden's massive subsidies for new factories are mostly benefiting red states. Now, this could explain why Democrats are relatively negative about the economy, which in turn could explain why, on average, people are also relatively negative about the economy. After all, citizens of booming Republican states will be negative about the economy because Biden is president. So there it matters less that their economies are doing relatively well. Meanwhile, blue state citizens are still more positive than those in red states, but they are not super positive because their economies are actually not doing that well. If this is true, it means that political polarization is causing Mr. Biden's economy to be underappreciated.
You know what could never be decoupled? Hello, Devil EMS. Welcome in, welcome in. It's so nice to see you. That reminds me, someone I know actually does have a D's nuts emote. But welcome in, welcome in. Hope all is well.
Rather than media negativity. But what if both of these theories about an underappreciated economy are wrong? What if regular Americans are actually right and actually the numbers are wrong, thanks to rising inequality? Something that can essentially already be seen if we look back at the differences between real GDP,
Bro, this is just how politicians politic. They blame each other rather than dealing with the issue. Right, exactly, right? That is one of those things that, like, yes, right, economists can focus on, like, the specific numbers, but like, as soon as you start to use polling data, it's kind of like, well, it's a vibe session because they're making it one, right? Like, they're the ones, to do that, right? And so it's kind of like, well, bourgeois politics, but how about, I don't know, we have I don't know,
average income and the average real wages of American workers. As you can see here, well, real GDP dropped during the pandemic. It then recovered quite quickly. However, here we can see that real wages have really only now just recovered to their pre-pandemic trend. Essentially, that means that average working people have felt the impact of rising prices more than they have seen their wages increase, at least up till now. So from their perspective, they were genuinely experiencing a recession. And so they were right to feel more pessimistic about the economy, really, until now. And indeed,
Sure, please go ahead.
It's only now that we see that people are getting more optimistic about the economy.
Oh my gosh, even Paul Krugman said that. Oh gosh, Paul should have just retired and just, I don't know.
More evidence for this theory can actually be seen if we look at income inequality in the United States. Here.
Okay, I don't know. Okay, income inequality. To say that it went down during the pandemic is ridiculous. Where have you been? We've been dealing that for the last 40 years, right?
We can see that while it got a lot better in 2020 and 2021, mostly thanks to Biden's stimulus checks, inequality then once again got way worse.
Wait, you're telling me that giving the working classes money that they should be earning anyway, but that's giving them money will reduce income inequality? Very interesting. But of course we can't do that because the economy, right? Can't do that, of course, because heaven forbid.
2022 as the stimulus measures ended. Similarly, if we look at the supplemental poverty rate, which takes into account the rising costs of living due to inflation, we can see that it is now also higher than it was when Biden took office, even though, like general inequality, it had dipped significantly thanks to Biden's relief fund.
Oh, wow. Who would have guessed that, even the supplemental aspects of poverty, could have been, and this is another thing too, right? He's focusing in on the stimulus checks as like reactionary YouTubers that talked about this did as well, but it's not also mentioning the fact that like SNAP benefits, right, or food stamps as they're often called, right, were given automatically, right, like for more people as they were allowed to do so, right? Like a lot of social safety net benefits were allowed to be given to more people than they otherwise would have been, right? That also helped reduce, again, the impact of poverty, because now people did not have to, spend such a high proportion of their paycheck, for example, on food, for example. So at my ambulance company, we have teams that are dedicated to pediatric transports for this hospital where we spend most of our shifts. And one of our dedicated teams found Fuck Jerry and Elaine written in Sharpie in the front cab of the ambulance. Admittedly, Jerry and Elaine are a little over serious and have a history of rubbing people the wrong way. Okay.
During COVID. So while average GDP growth looks pretty good, lagging real wages and increased inequality suggests that it is plausible that up to now only a few Americans.
And now they found a note in saying, "Oh, fuck dedicated assholes." Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. I mean, I definitely do like there is this like the people that are like tryhards, I guess, right? Oh no, that's even worse. So you have a weird stalker. Oh my gosh, that's so weird. And that has access to... That's so weird.
Americans are really
So yeah, someone keeps doing this. Oh my goodness. Like, what can you even do, though? Because, like, it's not like you can lock them, right? Like, you don't want to put in more barriers for you to, go inside. Oh my gosh, and then you also like, well, I guess like when you're in it, right? Like when you sleep, for example, right? Like when you rest, I should say, right? Like, oh my gosh.
Profited from this booming economy, and therefore it makes total sense that most Americans were as pessimistic as their European counterparts. On the other hand, if we look at the surveys, we can see that while those that filled them out were relatively negative about the economy, they were actually quite positive about their own financial.
And yeah, Jerry and Elaine are annoying as fuck, but this is a very bizarre obsession. Yeah, I mean, like, it would be one thing to write it once, right? Or to whatever. But it's a different thing to, like, to do it multiple times. And to, Oh, no worries. No, I understand.
financial situation, which
I mean, it's a very stressful situation, right? So.
is why the most logical conclusion is that all of these factors play a role, although not equally so.
Yeah, so essentially Yuri is saying, it's complex what makes people, think about what they're doing. No. I mean, essentially Yuri is essentially getting to the fact that people might feel that the economy is worse. And overall, it is worse for the average person, like the working classes. Because, again, if you ask people in general, right, in general, it doesn't mean that necessarily working class people will be the ones who respond to a survey, right? Because then you have to presume certain things. One, that they have the time to, right, because that's just one of the things too, right? With homework, right? Growing up, homework was something that I really disliked because I literally did not have the time, nor the place, I would like to add, to do it, right? It was oh, well, you can go home and ask your parents to help you. I'm like I couldn't say this, right? When I would go to school in the US, but I still lived in Mexico, right? It's until my parents are done with work, which is not until way later, I have nowhere to go. I'm stuck, at school. So I could, do my homework, but now I'm doing that, right? Instead of doing, other things I would prefer to do, let alone, and I'm just, going off into one thing. But those are some of the, aspects that, because, then they use those things, right, to depreciate grades, right? And then they use penalties for that depreciation against, right, marginalized communities even more so. So again, unless I stayed in the school and wasn't kicked out, right? Because if you go to certain schools, right, particularly if you go to an inner city school like myself, then the chances of them just letting you sit around for a long time is very low. So, and that was one of the things. It's well, where am I supposed to go? My parents aren't here. I'm a child, right? But now I have to, finish this homework that, something we could have done in class with the teacher. And instead, now I have to do outside of the class, under the presumption that I go straight home afterwards, right? And that I can ask my parents and that I can do all of these things, right? And if I don't have that, then it's held against me, right? And then eventually, your grade, again, I'm just giving one quick example, people's grades depreciate over time. Then if you can't make it to school on time because, again, I had to cross an international border, the busiest international border in the entire world, I might add, every single morning, it does not necessarily give rise to getting to school on time perfectly, as you might expect. So, then they start to give penalties on that as well. So, at some point, right, you begin to everything that you're doing, right? Oh, why isn't this happening? Why isn't that happening? Blah, blah, blah. Because I can't. Right? That's the reason why, one of the things that Finland did by removing homework, the reason why that allowed for children to get, say, higher grades, is because of the fact that, again, the penalties held against not doing work that presumes you have the chance to do it outside of the classroom, right, is removed. And so then you're not penalized, right, by that fact, the fact that you don't have the ability to do that. In the United States, however, I always found it that many of the teachers I had would instead try to offload as much as they could into the homework stuff they would give us, right? Even more stuff that we would have to do, at home. And I always was and I would be honest with them, I cannot do all of this, right? I'm sorry. There's no way I can do all of this project all by myself at home. I don't go straight home after school is over. Right. And it's I'm not, What else am I supposed to do, right? Like, what else can I do? Okay. So now we are going to look at let's see. Oh, South Africa makes an urgent request to the
South Africa
ICJ.
says it's lodged an urgent request with the International Court of Justice over Israel's military operations in Rafah. It's asked the UN's top court to consider if an Israeli ground operation in Rafah would require judges to use their powers in order to prevent further breaches of Palestinian rights.
Like, what I don't understand is, like, the fact that Israel the next day, or even that day that the judgment came down, right, from the hearing, was already in violation thereof, right? Like, in a just world, in a truly just world, Israel would, like, this should mean that the judgment against Israel should already, they should already be inclined to give us a guilty charge, in my opinion. But that's not how the court works. In fact, that was one of the things, like, when I went over it on stream, like the sort of rules of the court, right? And I was going over, like, the statute of the court. I didn't want to get too much in the weeds because I know it can be very boring. But again, as someone that's researches genocide studies or researches in genocide studies, right? Like, it's one of the things you have to kind of know. At least if you're talking about, like, contemporary stuff, for sure. And so, never mind. Technically, it doesn't matter if it's contemporary. You can even look at historical things too. People will research and know about it. But especially, I would say, in some sense, like, the more contemporary you work in, the more relevant, one might argue, knowing the rules of the court kind of becomes. But the point being that, like, the fact that it's still going to take years, up to it's going to be like 5 years before anything is decided, is just, again, we have to recognize from a leftist perspective that the chances of them actually coming down and saying that Israel did commit genocide is very low. I mean, technically it could be found, but then what its options, what South Africans' options are, is to take it to the UN Security Council for enforcement, because the court itself does not have an enforcement body. So, you see the problem.
Last month, South Africa brought a case accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. Judges later ruled that Israel must take...
By the way, this is literally, like, when people talk about Rafah, this is literally what they're talking about. And the Security Council is, basically America. It's America 3 times over, right? Because the French and the British... Because, the British were already voted to not have the... not to have the immediate ceasefire, right? The French abstained. So even if it's, 2 no's, an abstention, and 2, like, it doesn't matter. As long as 1 says no, which will be the United States, it's never going to let Israel be feeling. Now, the General Assembly could do certain things, and I've explained that before. It could, as the General Assembly, vote by a majority vote to have Palestine be recognized as a member and to expel Israel as a member. It could do that. I don't know really what the chances of that happening are, because again, the UN at the end of the day is just another arm of US imperialism, Western imperialism in general. The other thing they could do is they could vote to make an ad hoc court. But again, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds now. The last time Canada was on the Security Council, good things happened, so Canada won't be getting back on it again. But then again, modern Canada isn't the same Canada as that era's Canada. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happened, like, in the 60s and 70s in particular, right? And I think one of those things was because you had a lot of various liberation struggles that were happening, and the Soviet Union was not, like, imminent in its collapse, right? It still was kind of, in many cases, up in the air, one might say. So a lot of things were able to be pushed through. Oh my goodness. Vidingale, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the raid. I appreciate it. Hello, welcome, everyone. Welcome in. Make sure to refresh so that you're counted as a viewer. Welcome in. I am Shakespeare. I am a cultural historian. Right now we're talking about Palestine and the new request on South Africa to the ICJ. Welcome in, everyone. I really appreciate it. Hello. Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Zed. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, I am so happy that I was accepted to TCT-TV. Truly proud. Yes, Free Palestine. I believe it's this one. Yes. Free Palestine, from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. So welcome, everyone. Again, I'm a cultural historian. We were talking about Bidenomics a little bit earlier. Right now we're talking about Rafah and the new request, as I said, South Africa has done with the International Court of Justice. Hello, Vidingale. Welcome, and thank you so much for the grade. How was your stream? How was your stream? And please make sure to follow Vidingale, who, again, is a very wonderful streamer and definitely deserves to be followed. And yes, Free Palestine. Oh, yes, for sure. I really like all of the different Free Palestine ones. I need to get one myself. Like, hello, Dead End Joker. Welcome in. Yes, the late raider has arrived, indeed. Welcome in, everybody. Welcome in. Thank you so much, Raiders. And again, please make sure to refresh so that you're counted as a viewer. If you would like to, you can always, follow. And I would appreciate that. It was good. Thank you for asking and the warm welcome. Of course. Hello, Phoenix Dragon. Hello.
Specific actions to prevent that. Let's speak to Famida Miller. She's across all of this for us from Johannesburg. Famida, explain this move by South Africa. What has the presidency done here?
Well, you've just outlined some of the orders that were given about 3 weeks ago, and this is an extension of that. And the Department of International Relations in South Africa has said that their request to the International Court of Justice is based on Rule 75.1, where it can approach the court for an urgent order without having to have another hearing, and that the court could use its own discretion given what is happening in Rafah and given the urgency of the situation, and to prevent a further loss of life. And as the Department of International Relations has said, the court should consider additional measures because of the urgency, which we had pointed out, and the risk of imminent harm to the rights of Palestinians. There's always been a concern around implementation of that original order by the ICJ. In terms of,
like, that was one of the things I had an issue with too, is that the ICJ gave again, we know that South Africa, again, like I said, in a just world, South Africa's application as well as its argument for its oral arguments that it gave, right, on the 12th of January, deserve to be, like, in legal textbooks for, international law, because they were amazing, right? Like, again, if you would like to look at it, by all means, I also have the files if people want to read them. I'll probably post them at some point, because I actually would encourage people to look through kind of like the arguments and the evidence presented. But one of the things is that the actual, right, things that the court did come down on, right, was that it did not technically ask Israel to do an immediate ceasefire. Now, again, the court does not have enforcement power, so it technically could not compel the state of Israel to do so. But again, there are those other mechanisms that I just mentioned, right, via the General Assembly, but particularly through the Security Council, right? That's typically what you're supposed to do, right? And even Professor Boyle, right, who won multiple orders, including the first order ever granted by the International Court of Justice in the case of Bosnia against Serbia, right? thought, that more stuff should have been given to, more provisions should have been given to South Africa against Israel, that is to say. And yes, if you'd like to support me, my puppies, and my research, you can always go to my Linktree, and or if not, you could always go to my Throne, which you can help sponsor my research. Currently trying to get this book here, but yeah, would like to. Or of course, you can always subscribe. That's also always appreciated.
Of Israel preventing the loss of civilian lives, the provision of humanitarian aid. So while that order was given, there's always been concern around monitoring and implementation, and if Israel would pull back, which we haven't seen yet. And South Africa is saying that Israel is already in breach of the order that was given several weeks ago, and tonight wants the court to put in place additional measures. What those measures are is unclear, but we know that South Africa is asking for a declaration that ultimately would protect Palestinian lives.
Famida Miller there with the latest on that move from South Africa. For us from Johannesburg. Thanks, Famida.
Let's just jump right into it and turn to our first topic.
Oh my goodness. Hello, Levelhead. How are you? It's so good to see you. Hope all is well. Welcome in, welcome in. Hello. Okay, so will Texas secede? I wonder. I don't think so. I don't know. That's just me. What do you guys? What do you? Don't even just say, you guys. What do you all think? I don't know. Like sometimes I'm always like, about saying that because it's like my typical thing to say, you guys. But I know like that it's not a good idea to say that. LOL Texas. I mean, like I lived in Texas, and I can tell you this, they're never seceding. Like they will bring it up, but like, like that thing where like, you have that like really annoying like aunt or whatever that's always like, and you're just like, like, you know what I mean? Like it's like that's essentially what's going on there, right? So,
here, and we want to return to the issue of Texas, which is right at the center of U.S. politics now, as there's an ongoing.
Oh gosh, saying that Texas is at the center of U.S. politics just makes me think like, yeah, U.S. politics is just absolute trash. I mean, that's why.
Roiling debates over border policy, and I think everything that is underneath that. But of course, there's a lot of history.
They talk about seceding here too, the county, but without the state. Who's going to provide giant? I mean, it's kind of like the people that want the northern part, like the not San Francisco north, but even further north part of California to secede, or like, the only part of California that should be frankly expelled is Inyo County. Never go to Inyo County, okay? That is not California. I don't know what state that is. I don't know where that is part of. But it's just weird. I just do not want to go there. I've already brought up my like very great dislike of Inyo County, but like that whole area, like east of the Sierras and everything, definitely is always trying to like say that. And 70% tax of tax revenues come from oil and gas, but like 75% of workers here work for like the state or some government body. Yeah, that's another thing too, is like most of the rural counties, as many people will say here in California, sometimes anyway, is that one of the largest employers is like, I'm not even joking, like the Bureau of Land Management or, California Parks and Recreation, et cetera, right? So, it kind of doesn't work to suddenly not have, or the Forest Service, or who knows, right? It's always these like large, like the Department of Agriculture, the Department of the Interior, like so much. I don't think they will do it. It's more fascist Civil War posturing, yes. And it's interesting too, because we were bringing up how like one of the things that kind of allows them to manufacture this idea was how the maps, like the maps that say like, oh, red states, blue states, right, make it seem like there is such a divide, right, like that an entire state is red, right, because like of course empty land votes, if you actually look at it in terms of like population, most places, right, are, it's actually much more blue than people would imagine. But if you look at it in the way how like elections are, okay, thank you so much, Vidingale. Thank you so much for lurking. Self-reliant rural living. I think the term you're looking for is subsidized. I mean, the fact that like literally everything that they do is always like, oh, there's a subsidy for solar panels, right? Like all of that stuff, right? It's like, it's always something along those lines. So
Bringing a lot of roots to all these things and a lot of future repercussions from that history and our contemporary reality. And to discuss all of that and more, we are honored to be joined here by Dr. Gerald Horne, who's a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston and the author, among other things, of The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Dr. Horne.
Even rural counties aren't like 100% Republican. It's a self-perpetuating idea, though. Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, like, that's one of the things where, like, this is where people will then say, like, this is where a lot of the, like, conspiracy theory stuff comes out, right? Like, where then they will say because immigrants or whatever reason, like, that's why people vote, that's why the Democrats win such and such amount of votes. And it's like, no, it's literally like Jan, like the lady at the, I don't know, at like the 5 and dime, it's like that's who votes Democrat, not people that literally cannot vote. You can keep all of your Tucker Carlson conspiracies to yourself, but libs keep real quiet. But they definitely are out here. I mean, like, that's what I'm saying. Like, even in pardon me, that's also plays part into what I'm saying, right? Like, if you go to like Visalia, California, or like out there like Exeter, California, right? Like even Selma, California, which, by the way, if you start noticing that a lot of towns in California have like names that are like places in the South, there's a reason for that. It's the same reason why a lot of people in the eastern part of Washington State and Oregon also are actually from the South, or like historically were from the South. Just note that. Sounds like a lib would say. I mean, you're not wrong, Punk Rose.
Thank you so much for being
Also, I should say, 1836 was the reason why it's important to recognize that as sort of like influential for U.S. fascism is because that's when the pro-slavery revolt, right, against Mexico happened, right? Texas was not part of the United States when that happened, right? Like, it declared independence, right, from Mexico. It didn't declare independence from the United States. And the reason why it did this was literally because they were breaking the law, right? They were enslaving people. They were bringing in slaves. That's why they wanted the land in Texas. And then once they did declare independence, and even after the U.S. intervention, as some might say, or the War of American Aggression, whatever, no, it became part of the Union because then it became part of the Union first because then it became a slave state prior to that, right? So it was part of the Confederate States of America, like as a state, because it was one prior to that. But this isn't his book. Dr. Horne's book is looking at Texas in 36, which is when Texas declared independence, right, to found the Texas Republic in Houston. I mean, this is actually where the capital was, which is funny too because I kid you not, the first president of Texas and also the last president of Texas was Sam Houston. So he ruled Texas. So President Houston ruled ruled Texas from Houston, which was named after him. So, but one of the major issues that, like, the issue was that in 1810, in the Declaration of Dolores, right, and throughout the independence movement of Mexico, right, the end of things like the Inquisition, right, which lasted until the 19th century, as people might know from my stream, and also the institution of slavery were abolished, right? So from 1810 to 1820, which is when so much of the struggle is taking place, right, is when you have, more and more land being won back from, reactionary and Spanish forces. But generally speaking, 1810 is when, that's when, Mexico's quote-unquote 1776 happened, right, to sort of compare it in that way. But, so Texas already had abolished slavery, so to speak, because Mexico had. Then the Anglos that move into Texas are like, if we were to bring in slaves, we could make it so that at some point Mexico couldn't do anything about it, right? Because they would literally... So what essentially that line of thinking is that Mexico kept saying, you cannot have slaves, right? Slavery is illegal. They said, well, they're not slaves. They are lifelong servants of the family that, due to a contract which they made prior to entering Mexican territory, blah, 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 all of that stuff, right? It was literally that absurd. That's how absurd we're talking. It was literally slavery with extra steps, right? That is one of the things. But the war between Mexico and Texas was not, the war between the United States and Texas was not where Texas became a state. Texas became a state before that. And that's actually what gave the United States the reasoning or the justification for the border dispute in the first place with Mexico. So, were there a lot of Anglos of white Spanish who were early settlers in Texas? So there were white Spanish people that had settled in Texas, but there were also German Catholics, right, Irish people that had immigrated to Mexico, right, at the time. But the Mexican government began to give, and this is pretty standard in the, it's sort of like California, Texas, right, land grants. This is typically how a lot of land was often parceled out. So these land grants, one of them, because of Moses Austin, and then later Stephen Austin, who is, the one who is more famous than Moses Austin, got a huge colony, as they called it, the colony. And so they started to move in white Anglo, Americans to live in Texas. And so they made rules on that, like, one, you can't have slaves because, it's illegal in Mexico. But of course, they were like, oh, but the law doesn't actually apply to us because, we're special, et cetera, et cetera. There were other people that lived there as well, right? There were people of the different racial castes as had existed. And also, as existed under the Spanish, right? But another thing too is there were people like Afro-Mexicans or Afro-Mestizos, right? Who, because of the fact that they were mixed with, African blood, right? Or at least, in that sort of weird ideological way, right? They began to see, oh my goodness. Oh, thank you so much, Carbipex. Thank you so much for the follow. Hello. Because of that, when the Texans took over, they would either drive people off of their land, like Mexican citizens or Mexicans in general, regardless of whatever racial category they would be put in now. But if people had African ancestry, they would literally say that they would either leave or we will re-enslave you. That was one of the things. And again, this is from, many horrors, I'll put it like that. So there were lots of white people from Spanish more heritage that moved into Texas, but at the same time there were also lots of people that came in overwhelmingly so, right? Because then at some point they began to, and I'm not even joking, the people that actually, if you want to talk about like borders and all the sanctity that the United States likes to do, they actually would do that into Mexico. So then that way they could, steal the land, That's why Mexico does not allow Americans to like buy land within 100 miles of the border because, or the sea, because, issues, historical issues. White people history is clownship every time. I mean, you're not wrong. Galveston was an alternate port of entry into the U.S. Yes, especially because you could have like steamers for sure come from different parts of the Americas as well. And there used to be a steamer that I think was monthly, but I could be wrong about that, that back in the day went between Galveston and Havana. Like people would back in the day. Well, I mean, I say back in the day, it was definitely before I was born, but like, or before I was even, whatever, like even my parents, but like back in the turn of the century where you could actually like travel between Galveston and Cuba. It would be nice to still have that, but
Back with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, happy to have you here. Texas, Martin Dies, one of the early heads of the House Un-American Activities Committee, George W. Bush, Abbott, Nelson Bunker Hunt, who is a big funder of the John Birch Society. I mean, it seems wherever you look, Texas is a cradle of a lot of a reactionary American history. Why do you think that is?
I wonder why that is. Also, another thing, too, is a lot of the mythology of the Border Patrol and, like, the Texas Rangers and all. One, it's all mythology. Like, it's literally just, like, people think that they had this, good history in the past, but that's not actually true. And a lot of it has to deal with they began as, I'm not even joking, literally to drive people off of their land who were not considered white in the United States after 1848. Because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo says that everybody who was a Mexican citizen that stayed or that lived in what is now California through Texas could choose to get American citizenship if they wanted to. But the thing is that they said that knowing full well that actually that wouldn't actually happen. So what they did was, well, actually, the United States defined citizenship on the basis of whiteness. So whoever was considered white could have citizenship, nobody else. So then this became a huge issue and, again, led to the creation of essentially paramilitary forces, right, and vigilante forces that then were laundered over time to be like, oh, the Texas Rangers, right, when in fact they were like, bad. Well, they already are bad, but worse, Well, actually, they still are worse. You know what I mean? Just really, really bad. There were also train tickets from New York to Havana. The train gets on a... Hello, Swamp Goth. Welcome in. Also, train tickets from NYC to Havana. The train gets on a ferry and put on a rail to Cuba. Oh, nice. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because COVID ended a lot of the stuff too, like because of, capitalist reasons, right? When Cuba was a colony. Okay. Is that you used to be able to travel still on a steamer ship between, or like a crew, the big ships that people think of, right? Between New York and London, technically not London, but New York and Southampton. But I don't know if you can still do that.
What's behind that, Dr. Horn?
Well, first of all, Texas is so large. It's the largest state in the lower 48, surpassed only in territory by Alaska. Texas also was an independent country from 1836 to 1845. Recall that it seceded from Mexico.
To see, like, it was an independent country for those 9 years. And in 1845, it was admitted as a state. And then from 45 to 60, well, so 61, I guess one could say, but technically 60, it essentially, worked to secede again from the the United States that it worked so hard to become part of, apparently.
In 1836, not least because Mexico had moved under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, to abolish enslavement.
Right. It was under Vicente Guerrero, who is essentially was the second president of Mexico. he was the one that officially, like on paper, abolished slavery in 1829, right? And so that is again, that was one of the things that was kind of the independence movement's chief things, was that they were going to abolish the Inquisition, the racial caste system, or as it existed then, right? Like where everything was determined by the caste system that the caste that you were born in racially, and then slavery, for example, which in many ways, so it was promulgated into the Constitution in 1829.
The settlers, led by Sam Houston, Stephen L. Austin, and others who ostentatiously affixed their names to leading cities, were having that. They seceded, but alas, they could not withstand the abolitionist pressure from revolutionary Haiti and their allies in London, and they crawled into the Union by 1845. But then by 1860, 1861, Texas was objecting to the United States, not unlike the grounds on which it is objecting today. What I mean is,
well, one thing I think is really interesting is that Texas, there were two camps in Texas. One of them was become part of the United States, right? Join the Union. The other one was, which is, again, like I mentioned before, in 1845, it was all about joining the Union. Then about 15 years later, it was leave the Union, right? So anyway, but are Texans ever accused of double loyalty? No. No, just joking. But anyway, the point being that one of the reasons why Mirabeau Lamar, that was the president, so the way how the Texas presidency worked was that they couldn't serve consecutive terms. So Mirabeau Lamar was the second president, right? But within it was Sam Houston, Mirabeau Lamar, Sam Houston, and then it became a state. So because you couldn't have consecutive terms, right? That's why Mirabeau Lamar couldn't. Mirabeau Lamar really wanted Texas to stay independent, mainly because even in the 1840s, it was already understood from, say, England, because England had abolished the slave trade and the United States had abolished the slave trade, sort of like the people might understand, like the Middle Passage, for example. It had abolished that, but not like the chattel slavery as such. That because of that, it wanted to continue that on as its own country. So Texas quite literally had two factions: one, slavery as the United States, right, or slavery as an independent country. Those were the two options, right? So, just so
that Texas felt the United States in 1860, 1861 could not prevent their labor force, speaking of enslaved
Thank
Africans,
you so much,
from
Bidenomics.
fleeing south of the border. Thousands upon thousands. Many of us know about following the North Star to abolition in Canada. But of course, there was a path to abolition in Mexico as well. And so
And that is always one of those things that's never really talked about, that so many people did, in fact, cross the Rio Grande in order so that they could, because, again, obviously, in an idealist sense, right, it's like as soon as you set foot on Mexican soil, you are free, right? That is how the law goes, right? But the main thing being that, once in Mexico, the idea of you even belonging to anyone was didn't exist, right? In kind of like how I forget how it's actually called now. I'm starting to but the law that essentially made it so that you even if you ran away, the Runaway Slave Act, which was essentially even if you ran away to a free state, you could still be deported, so to speak, in one sense, right, to back to the South, right? You would still be considered an enslaved person even there, right? And so that's why people had to go to Canada or to Mexico. Oh, hello. Oh, thank you so much, Baked Riemann Zeta. Thank you so much for the raid. I appreciate it. Welcome in, welcome in. I appreciate it. Please make sure to follow our friend Baked Riemann Zeta. Welcome, Raiders. Oh, okay. Still, everybody counts.
of that, Texas was a leader in the...
Oh, so So one of those things that was doing a sad girl stream, setting up sound alerts, brought my viewer. Okay, a sad girl stream, like actually sad girl stream, or like aesthetically sad girl stream. Setting up sound alerts. Yeah, like I finally went on Twitch to like set mine up, and I finally found out how to oh, I'm so sorry about that, Big Dream and Zeta. I send you a big, big hug. Truly, like. It's getting better. Good. I'm glad to hear that. So the Fugitive Slave Act, right? Like it existed within the United States. So even if you ran all the way to California, right, it didn't matter. You could be repatriated, so to speak, all the way back to whichever of the slave states that you had run away from. But if you went to Mexico, obviously it being a different country, even the idea that you were once enslaved was something that, again, by legal statute, did not legally exist. So they could never even, accuse you of, like, in civil court or anything like that, right? Like, the idea that there was such a state that you possibly could have existed in was one that, in legal terms, did not exist either. Which, again, it's kind of difficult to kind of think of now, but, like, because people's enslaved status did follow them even after they were emancipated, right? Where they had to like show that they were emancipated. In Mexico, it was that by also removing the need to be an emancipated person as such, right? Like removing that that sort of prefix of existence, right? In that sense, that
the so-called Confederate States of America, which waged war on the United States in order to ensure that Africans would be enslaved forevermore, and were defeated. However, now, fast forward to 2024, you see that Texas is objecting once again to a question of labor. That is to say, they're saying that the United States is not able to prevent labor from south of the border, particularly Mexican labor, from coming into the United States of America. And they see that as a reason for friction and conflict. And therefore, if you go to Eagle Pass, Texas, abutting the border with Mexico, you'll find not only conflicts, dangerous conflicts between the U.S. Border Patrol and armed official Texans, not to mention unofficial armed Texans.
Yeah, this is a huge problem with me personally. Like, some people, like, the fact that the state of Texas has, like, laws on the books that say if you're a vigilante, right, and you want to enforce the border, right, on your own, right, with your, your group of friends, right, from the local, whatever, I don't, from the local, Elks Club or whatever they're called, the Rotary Club, I don't know, that you can do that, right? Like, you actually can essentially police, right, the border and harass people, and I'm saying that very mildly. That's like very mild what I'm saying. The reality of it is actually much worse, right? Like, the amount of license that this gives those vigilantes is very high. Like, the people that try to say, oh, it's not that bad, it's that bad. It's worse than people think. It's worse than they say on the news. Because it literally and this actually was reported once, that like there were people that literally could not get charged with murder because they were on duty, as so to speak. Like, oh, well, we thought they were this, so therefore that excuses us. That should horrify everybody. So I would think. But again, this goes back to how like the policing of the border is something much greater than what people sort of come to think about, right? Like when that Freedom Convoy, whatever it was called, actually showed up to Eagle Pass. And this actually happened on Fox News, if I remember correctly, but it could have been CNN, perhaps. I mean, they're essentially the same thing anyway. They said, I was actually surprised because I didn't see anybody here. Like, they said, oh, there are like millions of people waiting. And that wasn't true, right? Like, they love to show these images. And they actually have determined multiple times over that there were actually clips that were from old, past periods of time, or sometimes they weren't even of what they were talking about. But that's that's besides the point, right? It's that, again, they're able to drum up all of this vitriol. but then also create laws on the books that allow for extreme violence, right? Vigilante violence against people for, I'm not even just literally seeming to the vigilante as though they are illegal, right? And that's what that record. I know people have probably seen this clip, right, where the guardian angels or whatever they're called, right, the guys with like the red beret and the red, right, they like start literally beating up some kid because they think he's a shoplifter, and they like blanket him essentially. And so yeah, that's kind of like not good, you know. And that is one of those aspects, like simply for seeming like a criminal, right? As though, you know, being brown, and especially in the Southwest, right, isn't already seen, you know, aligned with a sense of criminality. That is to say, it's something that is placed upon, right, by whiteness. Is that then that means that, you know, we have to deal with so many of these things all the time. Now we have to deal with the extreme violence too, and that's on top of the violence that's already permissible against, you know, brown bodies, right, in the American Southwest. And that's kind of the thing where you begin to see, right, worldwide violence and its connection to the, what I mentioned in last year, right, the walled world, where like the barrier wall in the West Bank and you know, Palestine, and the border wall here in the United States, they share, right, similar technologies, right? Like the stuff that's tested sort of on the Palestinians is then used to police the U.S.-Mexico border. So that's why it's very important to also consider not only these historical things, but also how these historical things still tie together even in this, you know, imperialist world of ours.
Including right-wing truckers, the so-called Army of God.
Yeah, the IDF trains U.S. cops. Exactly. Yeah, and not only that, but it's like you'd be surprised the police departments that do that, right? Like some people think, oh, it's like the NYPD, right? I mean, literally, it's like, you know, it's like lacrosse. You know what I'm saying? It's like a Eau Claire, you know, Wisconsin PD. You know what I mean?
The state of Idaho, a red state in good standing, has sent its officials to the border as well. So it's a very inflamed situation that we must pay attention to.
Dr. Horn, I really appreciate that you're framing it around that, because, you know, when we talk about the anti-immigrant movement in the U.S., the far-right movement in the U.S., I mean, the various militias that make it up, the way it grew under Donald Trump and was empowered under Donald Trump, and the fact that you've repeatedly had even U.S. Homeland Security say over and over again that actually the biggest threat domestically in the U.S. is, in fact, the armed far right, whether it's lone wolves or whatever they call them, or these more organized forces. When we see what's happening right now in Texas, how does that feed into that growing movement? I mean, you also have this happening in a presidential election year when Donald Trump, you know, just like last time around, he seeks to gain attention and support and to rile up his base using this sort of anti-immigrant racist hate speech that, you know, that's very much, I think, attached or in line with the sort of sentiment we see rising in Texas. I guess I just said a lot there, but can you just unpack what this means about the empowerment of the far right? I was surprised to see that not get the attention it deserved as this Texas standoff has played out.
Well, recall that it was just a few years ago that in El Paso, Texas, which by some estimates has the largest predominantly Mexican-American majority city in the United States of America, that you had an armed right-winger who came to Walmart and began shooting people down.
Oh, really? Oh, that's awesome. Oh, if you want to send it to me, definitely make sure to join my Discord. That way you could send it to me there. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Tail and Wings. I appreciate that, Tails and Wings. That's so sweet of you. Yeah, like I've been trying to get new emotes because some of them are either like well, I did want to keep, I like wanted to get some and I got new ones, but some of them I'm like, you know, they're not really used that much, or you know, but I've been wanting to get a Palestine one, like Palestinian flag one, etc. That's why, like, I try to wear either so I have multiple kufiyas. So I have this one, the white and black one, I also have my like one that's actually from Palestine. That's like or rather one that's made from Harbawi, I believe, or Harbiwi, I forget. Pardon me if I'm mispronouncing the name, but like the famous one that's in. Okay. Oh, awesome, perfect. Thank you so much, Tails and Wings. And so I have that one that has like it's in the Palestinian flag colors, and then I have like a gray, and it's like this one, but just gray and black. And the oldest one actually is the one that was gotten for me by a friend of mine in Palestine. Like I unfortunately have never been for multiple reasons, right? Also like personal decision not to, due to the circumstances. But like I have been, to other, but my friend just happened to go, and they're, Lebanese. And so when they went and they felt comfortable going there, they brought me back. They brought me back that kufiya.
Like they were dogs. He was, of course, inflamed by this idea that supposedly people from south of the border were streaming into Texas. That was a reason that led, he said, to his one-man armed uprising. But then again, I must focus attention on these right-wing truckers who have an inglorious history. Recall that in Canada, a year or two ago, that in objection to so-called COVID restrictions, they stormed into Ottawa and were seemingly bent on dislodging the Liberal Party government of Prime Minister Trudeau. And once again,
like this is another thing too, is like you see these, you can see these groups, right? Like you can see when they get together, and they like, this is why like when Haas and other people like Jackson Hinkle, etc., when they say like, oh, this is the actual revolutionary whatever, like it's not. Like it's so obvious. All you have to do is let them speak for themselves, right? Like they do not want, equity. They do not want right for the most marginalized to be, be given the tools by which they can seek their liberation, etc., etc. They want more marginalization, right? They just feel that they deserve certain dividends, right? For participating as the petit bourgeoisie in particular, right? Like reactionary dividends, I guess we'll call it that, right? Reactionary dividends, and that they are demanding that now, right? That they want those now. And so that's kind of what leads to, right, a lot of reactionary violence is in fact the like stumbles in late. Oh, no worries, Atticus. Welcome in.
you see armed truckers streaming into Eagle Pass, Texas. And for those with longer memories, you might recall what happened in 1973 in Santiago de Chile with the overthrow of Salvador Allende, the elected socialist president. One of the elements in that overthrow were once again right-wing truckers. So this is a...
See, like, this is one thing, again, for Dr. Horn. I think it's important that he does make that connection. Truckers brought in Pinochet. And again, like, okay, putting it like that can be a little bit, but it is important to note that, again, the petit bourgeoisie in particular, right? And that's why, like, the farmer protests in Europe are not like farm workers. It's, people that, can afford to buy, tractors, etc., right? It's not the peasantry that's doing an uprising. It's the petit bourgeoisie. And I don't want to like give into the kind of reading that some people like, I guess, is it Bordiga, that Bordiga kind of offers, right? That it's like, oh, that the petit bourgeoisie is like the most reactionary class, because that isn't true. The bourgeoisie by far is the most reactionary, almost by definition. But the petit bourgeoisie in particular, right, will often, again, demand those dividends from the bourgeoisie. And that is the reason why you see these things, right? My understanding was Texas cannot secede because of the 1869 ruling by the Supreme Court in Texas versus White. Well, I do think that you're right in citing that under case law, right? Like, it would be illegal, right? it would be illegal for it to secede. But the only thing that comes to mind is the fact that I feel that they wouldn't be looking, right? Like, I understand that point, and it is true. You're completely correct. But one of the aspects of the whole idea of secession is based in the fact that they don't want to be legitimated by the central government, right? So, like, that's part of the... Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Thank you so much, It's Socialism or Barbarism. Thank you so much for the 5 gifted subs. Wow, thank you. I appreciate it. You give one to... Oh my goodness, let's see here. We got one for Peganox. We got one for Mamsie. One for Baked Freeman Zeta. We got one for Powerful Finger and one for Swamp Goth. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Oh, that's so sweet of you. It's very sweet of you.
Very serious situation, and it's also taking place in the context of a very important political economic development. The U.S. press just reported the other day.
But essentially, once we joined the union, we lost the right to have the Yes, that's true. Like, that's one of those things where, like, for example, like, this is why I've always had a mixed feelings. Well, not really mixed feelings. I have quite negative feelings about the California flag. But the reasoning why is because the California Republic Revolt, or the Bear Flag Revolt as it was called, was a pro-slavery revolt, right? Like, that's why having it as the state flag has always irked me from when I learned that was the case. Because people are obviously against having the Confederate war flag one, but people often forget about the secessionist revolt in California that lost against Union soldiers, but it was able to temporarily hold some territory technically. But yes, like, one of those things is once you become part of the Union, yes, you technically lose the right to secede. That is correct. OMG, those guys in overalls with no shirts. I mean, yeah, that's on some level they want to do like stereotype things, right, of how they're portrayed, right, of how people that like live in the country, right, are portrayed, and one of those is like wearing overalls with no shirts. So
that Mexico has surpassed China as a major source of goods and exports. That is to say,
I mean, there they are, right? So not only that, but like Mexico has technically become the largest trading partner with the United States. Now, there's an issue with that from a Marxian point of view, in that that means that, of course, that is saying that America has so thoroughly imperialized Mexico that it's always going to extract much more than what it invests in, so to speak, right? Like, the benefit will never outweigh the extraction that is taken out. So there's that. And also, again, I just remind people, if you would like to keep up to date to all of the stuff, please join my Discord. But like, yeah, like the ability to take time off, right, and to participate in these actions far away from, same thing like with the what's it called, the freedom, whatever it was called. I just said it just a second or a few minutes ago. Yes, just give me one quick second. I always forget how to do this. There we go. Okay, there you go.
That there is.
Thank you, by the way. I actually was thinking earlier today that I'm like, I need more mods, because I know that I have mods that I share with other people that sometimes are very busy. So thank you.
Increasing integration of the economies of the United States and Mexico.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so very much. Oh gosh, I feel like I'm missing some oh my goodness. Why am I missing the activity feed? Oh, thank you so much for your subscription, Zedzir. I appreciate that. Oh, wow. Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yay. Also, like, come on. Like, again, like, one of those things to, like, in order to have the time off to, and yes, if you'd like to help me with my research, I understand, and thank you again, it's socialism or barbarism. I really appreciate that. And all of you that are here watching, if you'd like to help out my research, or awesome, thank you. Yeah, solidarity for sure. Always solidarity. Is that you can always help. Zed's a good egg. Oh, okay. I'm glad to hear that. Is if you'd like to help my research, you can always do so by, of course, going to my throne, sponsoring a book. You don't obviously have to buy the whole thing, but you know, anything helps. But also, if you'd like to help me, you know, in a bit more of a, you know, you can always go to my link tree as well. But that's of course your choice.
Which should not be surprising for those of us who follow the trajectory of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so, as a result of that,
oh, is that true? Oh yeah, history was like my best subject in school. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, no, like that's why oftentimes like my title will just be like, let's learn together, because like I used to be a Hasidic Jew, like when I was growing up, you know, I was raised that way. And like I always liked the placing, how like in the Hasidic world, it's not like, oh, like I'm going to teach you something, right? Instead it was like, let's learn together, right? Let's go learn. I always liked that kind of framing instead, because it was like, I don't know. I always liked that, so for sure. But yeah, that's awesome.
you see laborers flocking to the border, not only from Mexico.
Also, like being a libertarian is like one of those things where like in the global South is not a popular thing. Like because you have to actually, so as it were, live as though that were the case, right? Like again, I know of people who, and even like my grandparents, right? Like they had to pay to have the street where their house was in Tijuana to be paved. It wasn't paved by the city. They had to get together as a community and then make it so that then it could be paved, right? They had to pay the company to come in. Same thing with, and again, that's just one thing. But I also know people that live in other places where, again, there were no public services whatsoever, right? There is no maintenance of roads. There's no et cetera, where everything is, has to be done communally. Because if people did do the whole like hyper individualistic, nobody would do well, right? Like everybody would not survive, just to put it bluntly, right? Yes. I really like Hello Kitty and like Sanrio stuff. That's why I have like, and I really like Kuromi. In fact, I was showing this at the beginning of the stream that I got this little Kuromi box. So it has like Kuromi all around. It's so cute. So.
But from Central America, in fact, from all over the world. 60 Minutes did a piece the other day talking about labor from Africa and Asia flocking to the Texas-Mexico border. And this is helping to inflame xenophobic sentiments. It's helping to inflame anti-immigrant sentiments. You might have seen the rather startling video from New York City.
Okay, this is always, again, it's when I see people carrying around, like, I have no issue with a cross in and of itself, right? Like, that's not the issue. But when you're in these, like, very reactionary, like, when they're having these, like, get-togethers, or I don't even know what, riots, or what, I mean, whatever you want to call it, right? Whatever you want to say, these gatherings. whenever I see them pull out like a huge crucifix, it just really, it's very unsettling. I don't know what it is. It's just something about it. It's just kind of like it's not about like them being, it's just something. I don't know what it is though. Like I'm not sure. Because it's not like in and of itself, right? It's something about the way in which it's being used, right? Because it's used in a threatening manner, I guess one could say, right?
Where Curtis Lewa of the so-called Guardian Angels attacked a man on the streets of New York while being broadcast from Fox News, who he said was an undocumented worker, but actually he had just happened to be somebody from the Bronx.
See, so that's exactly, yes. Thank you again. It's socialism and barbarism. So again, that person's only crime was literally being brown, right? And they were from the Bronx, and so yes, thank you so much for the shout out to Levelhead. Yes, definitely join us in following Levelhead. He's a wonderful streamer who definitely deserves a follow for sure. And also is very knowledgeable about the Upper Colorado River watershed.
So for those of you who feel that because you're not an immigrant, you may be able to escape the wrath of this right wing, that incident from New York City just a day or two ago tells you something different.
No, very, very well taken point, and that was quite the video and quite the context. And one of the other things that I think is notable about this in many ways is the way sort of this kind of border politics is used to shape a particular U.S. nationalism. And you've got a lot of the same people who are saying we need to militarize the border, saying we should be launching drone strikes into Mexico, invasions, and sort of pitting the two against each other. And it sort of feels like there's also a historical link here, too, to the emergence of Texas, this dichotomy between a more progressive government in Mexico that, most Americans don't know this now, is appealing to Americans to, join with Mexico to push a more progressive policy in Central America. And then you have this concentrated sort of cradle of reaction there, right there on the border, sort of pushing things. So I wonder just how you think this relates to how sort of the people opposed to this right-wing drive in America should be relating to this question of U.S. nationalism.
So one thing I want to stress, too, is the fact that, is that the usage of, that violence needs to be taken against Mexico, right, is, of course, adding on to the violence that is already committed against Mexicans, right, in the United States, and the amount of surveillance that is, done upon brown bodies particularly. But one of those things that is also that also does too is that it makes it so that a neutral country, because Mexico is indeed a neutral country, is being threatened by the politicians of the country that has literally the most of, that essentially is the munitions industry of the world, right? That essentially they are the weapons manufacturers of the world, right? So it's like Mexico, again, is a neutral country, is a country that has always been receptive to refugees, etc. And again, it's not perfect. It definitely has many, many issues. But that's always, yes. Yeah, that's true. I technically have Pringles today, so I don't have to go that far. Yes, med check. Please make sure you are up to date on your day's medications.
Well, obviously, this question of so-called U.S. nationalism is a clear and present danger to civil liberties and to civil rights, particularly if you look back at history. If you reel back to your introductory remarks, we know that, for example, from Texas, you had some of the most significant support of McCarthyism. Matter of fact, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin was seen as the third senator from Texas because he was supported not only by Nelson Bunker Hunt, but also by other forces as well, who were part of the right-wing oil men cadre. And those right-wing oil men cadre are still in the driver's seat politically in Texas. Texas is a red state. It is a state where the Republican Party has been ruling for over 3 decades, continuously holding every top state office. The Attorney General, Ken Paxton, escaped impeachment despite a passel of misdeeds.
Never mind.
Recall
I
that he's
shouldn't. I
considered
shouldn't
a close
pause it
comrade
there
of Donald J.
because
Trump as well.
then it's like, oh, it looks like he's, yeah, yeah. So yes, it's one of those things too, where yes, yes, that's one of my subs. Yes, you can always support me in that way too. Again, like I don't want to be bringing it up, because again I don't like to, but because I was in the car accident on last Wednesday, just but if people can, you don't never feel compelled to.
Well, and so I think that for those in your audience who are concerned about the trajectory of the United States of America and concerned about the growth of the right wing, you certainly should focus your attention on Texas, because if you look at what happened on January 6, 2021, you'll find that a disproportionate percentage of the insurrectionists actually came from Texas, even though they had further to travel, say, than Virginians or Marylanders, etc. So this is.
And again, one of the things that also allows for a particular type of reactionary politics to occur in Texas is, again, the myth of the Border Patrol agent, the myth of the Texas Ranger, right? It's this myth of, even the myth of the Wild West. Like, most people, one of the sort of emblematic institutions, one might say, of what people think of the Wild West is like the Pony Express, right? Like that's one of the things that is mentioned. But if you really learn about it, like if you want to really know, like how long did the Pony Express last? Like how long did it, people would say, oh, from the entire 19th century, right? It must have lasted the whole, a long, long time, up until World War II, right? No, it actually lasted, and I'm not even joking, 18 months. Because then they built trains, and trains can carry mail a lot faster than ponies. So, because a lot of that like Wild West is just mythology, right? It's stuff that's been created as time went on, and especially in the 20th century, the myth of Texas, right, is something that is really big, but is an important thing in creating this particular reactionary politics in Texas because of the fact that it's on the border, right? Like it has a history of, right, white settlers, right, who came to not just, land where there was indigenous people, right, indigenous lands, but also to another country that's supposedly, right, they were supposed to respect the sovereignty of, right? Like the whole Monroe Doctrine, at least as people like to idealize it, the people that I guess think that it somehow was supposed to be beneficent, is that the United States would safeguard the sovereignty of all the nations in America, which is just an absolute lie. But that's one of those things, right? That it's like it violated the Constitution and laws of everything of a nation, right? Of its bordering nation, did all of the things that it accuses the people of, not even necessarily Mexico, but just generally speaking, people from their near abroad, as people in Russia might say, of their bordering countries. And so that also adds into this kind of necessity to create more and more mythology, right? To sort of justify, if not naturalize, so to speak, the idea that like Texas identity is this thing that has a long and storied history, right? That there actually is something about Texas that is unique and special, etc., as opposed to something that was constructed relatively recent in history. And so that is one of those things that really sticks out because of the border, right? And that's where the Texas Ranger aspect and also the border, the mythos of both of those come into play, because the fact that they were actually used to, again, make people, you're off to bed. Oh, well, thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for everything, for the emote. Have a good rest and have a good night. Take care. So that is kind of where you get a lot of these aspects too. Because like if you take Texas history And again, I am speaking from my own personal experience here, but remembering the textbook and how it was taught, the way in which they portray General Lopez de Santana, right, the president of Mexico at the time, they make him seem like he's on the same tier as, you know, the German leader from 1933 to 1945. And it's like, no, that is not what he was like at all. In fact, he got injured and was willing to stop the fighting, right? Like, definitely not at all like, but of course, the mythology, right, the need to demonize Mexico and Mexicans, right, began even then, back then. So that is where a lot of this comes from, right? The policing of people who were not considered white, so that then they would either go back to Mexico, quote unquote, as they might say, was something that started in Texas, right? Because it already had a significant population of people, right, that were Mexicans, right, citizens of Mexico, of different races, right, white, black, mestizo, which is mixed between indigenous, black and white, etc., etc., and then being dispossessed based on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo being done in quote-unquote bad faith, right? Like, the United States knew that it wasn't going to give people citizenship equally, as if, right, it was only going to give citizenship if they were considered white. So that also determined who did get to stay in Texas and who essentially got to be dispossessed and then by the Texas Rangers be literally ran out of, right, Rangers, right, like ran out of Texas, so to speak. So
it's a very dangerous state that I'm speaking about, and we need to focus on it.
So what's the answer here? I mean, I'm not. Yeah, obviously, there's not enough time to really get into how we fix it, but we can at least start. And I also want to add that, you know, I know Texas is seen as this far right place, but it's also not a very democratic place. And I don't mean big D Democrat. I mean small D Democratic place.
But the Lone Ranger and Tonto, they're real, right? It's really kind of one thing that always got me is like the portrayal of indigenous people in so many of those movies is just like, I don't even know what people were thinking when they did that. No. Oh, no. It's interesting insofar as like the decision in the way in which they decide to portray indigenous people says a lot, right? Because like in the 19th century, in like novels and stuff, you see this with like kind of one of the authors that started American literature as we know it now, right? Like, because there are earlier writers, right? Like Anne Bradstreet, right? Poetess, sort of early on during the colonial era. But like when we start to get kind of like the novels that really, we would know now, right? Like The Last of the Mohicans, right? Is that the way how they would talk about indigenous people was in the 19th century was that they were going, and I'm not even joking, that extinction was going to happen, right? Like in the anthropological sense, right? That like one day they will not exist, right? And so the way in which they talked about them was oftentimes in this like, I don't want to say sympathetic, but definitely with the whole like, the idea of like the noble savage, right? But in the 20th century, especially with the advent of film and television, like the way in which they began to portray indigenous people, just like it just started to change unbelievably. And you instead got like a completely different way in which indigenous people were and are still to this day portrayed.
Like it's there's all these voter suppression laws in Texas. There's a system built in that almost guarantees you're going to have Republicans be in charge forever. So I'm just curious if you could speak to the fact that Texas is really like in the hands of the far right politically. We're not just talking about movements on the ground. We're talking about elected officials. The governor is extremely far right himself. It's a pretty frightening place politically. And I'm just curious, like, what does that mean for the country moving forward?
Oh, it bodes ill for the country moving forward. For example, just a few weeks ago in Houston, which is not considered to be a citadel of the ultra-right wing, there was a pro-Nazi demonstration with swastikas and all the rest. You can go check it out in the Houston Chronicle,
Oh my gosh.
daily mainstream newspaper in Houston. They had two slogans: "Make America, quote, white again," unquote, and "Down with Jewish supremacy," believe it or not. And this is typical of the state of Texas. And by the way, the right wing is pushing to place secession on the ballot. Another echo.
Oh my god. Okay, Rick, like beyond what was just said about the demonstration in Houston, you've got to be joking. Like, you know what I mean? It's like the whole secession thing is just like a waste. I mean, again, anyway, it's just like, okay.
Of 1860, 1861. Thus far, they have been thwarted, but many of us do not expect them to be thwarted forever. You mentioned Governor Abbott. He was recently out of the country, touring the world. Now, we were told that he was touring in part to drum up investments for the state of Texas, but there are those who suspect that just like 1860, 1861, he's seeking to drum up support for secession. Now, of course, officially, he has not come out in favor of secession, but recall that Nikki Haley, the presidential hopeful on the GOP side, she made some rather curious comments a week or two ago and fundamentally interpreted as endorsing secession. And of course, she had to walk it back.
I mean, I guess you could. I mean, I guess technically that is how people interpreted it. But I don't think, like, when people say the secessionist, talking points, excuse me, I kind of don't believe them. Right? Oh, thank you so much for the shout out. Yes, please join us in following Vikingale, please. Secession would imply that they think the state is self-sustainable. Right. And it's also like, it's not so much that they actually want to secede. It's that they want to use the idea of secession, right, as a rallying cry, right, as a reactionary issue, right, that unites, right, all of the different factions of the far right. Right, just sort of gets all of that reactionary energy into this one supposed thing that they all want, and that allows them to couch it in, oh, well, self-determination, blah, 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 right? And in fact, there's a really good book about this that's called, like, Bland Fanatics Bland Fanatics is the one that is kind of the book that talks about this, but kind of like how Democrats or liberals in general, that they will, like, as long as you obfuscate things in, as much technical language, right, and jargon as possible, then they will support, something that if it were said plainly, they wouldn't, right? And this is one of those things, right, that it's like, then it allows the right wing to add in those words, right, and gain that support even from people that otherwise wouldn't be pro-secession or pro, far right wing, to think that they are doing something that's actually, like, worthwhile, right? And that's always where the danger lies, is like when the SPD starts to, you know what I mean? And so that's also it too, right? Like, secession is I wouldn't say a dog whistle, because we can all hear it, right? Like, it's obviously something else, right? Because, like, what is it that the people calling for secession want to do? And it's to militarize the border and to enact, again, brutalization, to brutalize and to enact, currently, like, the violence that is being enacted on people seeking refuge in the United States to be expanded, right? And so that, let alone people that are already, living in the United States. So that is where that also comes into, right? Like, it allows them to kind of launder that in this idea, right, that people actually.
So this is a very perilous and dangerous situation that is dangerous not only for folks like myself who live in this benighted state, but ultimately, a la 1860, 1861, could provide a clear and present danger to others who do not live in Texas.
No, I think that's a very well taken point, and seeing, whatever 25 states that backed Abbott in this broader border standoff, and the fact that he himself referenced the importance of remembering the Alamo when he was passing gun laws just before Uvalde, all very well taken points. Well, as always, really, really appreciate you being willing to join us here, Dr. Horn. I can't recommend higher The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. I'm like a third of the way through. Fantastic.
So again, like, yes, it does have a clear, and again, he's using, Dr. Horn is using those exact words for a reason, right? Because there's, of course, the idea that words, like, again, the things that can allow for the suppression of speech, right, where free speech ends, right, is when it represents a clear and present danger, right, to the people around. But one thing I think that also needs to be understood is that it's not, what I would like to add on to that, I feel like most people don't know how fucked up the Alamo was or what actually happened there. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if people think about the Alamo and they side with the white people, like the Americans, I don't know what to tell you. Like, and another thing too is that it's from that, right? From the raid, like it's from the Texas War, right, or revolt, right? That's where that that flag that's like white. Yes, the white flag that has like a cannon in it and it says "Come and take it." Right, like that whole thing was not even a U.S. thing, right? That wasn't used in the United. That was used in Texas, right, when it was, fighting for its independence from Mexico, right? So that's always one of those things that just always sticks out, right? It's like, well, you're using something that wasn't even used by your own country, right? But it's also part of that whole thing where the Texans already knew on some level, right, that they did represent the United States, right? They were colonizing for the United States, right? Because they saw themselves as Americans, hence why one of their biggest things was, how do we make the border between the United States and Mexico as porous as possible for Americans to come to the Mexican side, right? And to break all of the laws of the country we are in, right? I just know Tennesseans use the Alamo to talk shit to Texans. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, that doesn't surprise me in many ways because it is one of those things where it's like people like I don't know if people have ever watched the movie Pee Wee Herman's Big Adventure. Again, it's an old movie, but like I actually know people that have like I've heard people joke around about like the basement of the Alamo. Right, because that's something that shows up in the movie, and they're like, "Oh, I don't remember going to the basement," and it's like, or people will say like, "Oh yeah, the basement was my favorite part. Like, there's so much stuff down there," and I'm like, "What? Like, what are you talking about? Like, what basement? There is no basement." But it is what it is, I guess. I just remember, like, when I went there, that like the little building people see is just like like people forget that it was like a fortress, right? It was like a whole complex. It's not just that little building. But when you draw out, like you can follow, they have like these things on the street, right, that you can follow outside that shows you how large it is. But it's interesting because like when people are shown how large it is, then people don't see it as like as tragic of an event, right? Because then they're like, oh, they weren't just all in this one building, right? It was like, oh, they had this whole thing. And obviously, like when they talk about casualties, they only count white casualties. I'm not even joking. This is true. Even when they talk about it, even at the museums, they only talk about white casualties, because the other casualties, quote unquote, right, are unknown in many cases. So just make of that what you will. Just leave it like that. Yeah. Again, this is the same thing that happened in England. Like, there are people that like to say, oh, like up until the 20th century, there were never black people in England. That's untrue. We know people from the Middle Ages, for example, even in the Renaissance, right, that were black. But the thing is that most of the time we only know about them from, and I'm not even joking, their death record, because they were found in a public space, right, essentially abandoned by, like, the family that had them, living with them. So there are so many things where a lot of history for BIPOC is literally erased or unknown because it was intentionally done so. And the only way people do get put in the record is by, happenstance. Yeah, exactly. That's the reason why, like, one of the people that, the people that get upset about that, it's like, the Romans had on one hand, they had a huge empire, right? Like, they love talking about how Rome had the largest empire, right, the world had ever known up to that point. Fine. But then they're also like, but like, the people never moved. Like, they were just statues, essentially, right? Like, it's like they can't, it's like, no, that's not how that works. Like, they also think that, like, the contemporary view of whiteness existed then, when it's just like, no, there was no analogous view. But yeah, like, that's one thing I noticed, like, at the and again, that's why, like, for example, the organizations that sometimes are custodians of the museums and such, it is important sometimes to know what they are, because I know many people were half of modern England included in the Roman Empire. Something like that. I mean, Hadrian's Wall went pretty high up. I mean, it was up in, like, almost going into the lowlands of Scotland. So it was like in, like, Yorkshire, right? Like, somewhere up there by past Newcastle. So definitely more than half. And the Romans did go into Scotland. They just didn't. So much of Scotland is actually very difficult for habitation, and also is not arable land. Hence why the Romans did not really want to colonize it, right? But yes, quite a lot. And and like London, right? It's Londinium, right? Like, a lot of these places, Bath, right? Like the Roman baths, if you go there, you can still go to that. In fact, one thing I've always found weird, though, is, like, if you don't know this, like the city of Bath and how, like, they have the baths and all that stuff, then when you're reading Jane Austen in the book, which one is it? Is it Mansfield Park? No, it's not Mansfield Park. Northanger Abbey. And they go to Bath, I think, and they're talking about, like, going to the pump room. It just, like, like, considering contemporary language, like, it almost sounds like, like, and they're like, oh, that they're drinking the waters, and you're just like, what, like, what are these waters? And it's like, yeah, they're drinking, like, essentially, mineral water in a way, but which you still can do. But yes. But yeah, like it's funny because I always reference that movie, or I used to, because people used to have watched up the Pee Wee Herman's Big Adventure, but now I get, like, so few people that ever respond like I've seen it. So I just don't ever ask that. Like, when I want to bring up, like, the Alamo and, like, these things, right? Like, that's so I was mentioning, like, Auschwitz, for example. It was known that it blocked a lot of people, even Jewish people, right? Oh, you've never seen it? Yeah, I mean, like, it's just one of those, like, totally, like, I don't know, it's really popular in the 90s, like, early 90s, like, 91 to, like, 95. I, like, if you look at it, it's, like, I forget, someone was talking to me about this, that, like, it was most watched in, like, or I think it came out in the early 90s, right? If I remember correctly. Or no, it must be older. But it was really popular in the early 90s. I could be wrong. The exact years, but it was something like that. But, like, Auschwitz famously, or infamously, I should say, the original is great. The sequel, not so much. Right. I don't think I've ever seen the sequels. Just because, like, the original is really the only one worth watching, I would say, from what I understand of the sequels anyway. But Auschwitz essentially like blocked a whole bunch of people, including, you know, Jewish people, because they came out in support of, you know, like the state of Israel, right, and such, in this current moment of things, right? And so people that were like, you know, you shouldn't be siding with, right, you should represent some, you know, higher ideal, kind of were met with a kind of disappointing fact that the organization that runs it is not, you know, yeah, so that happened. But anyways, as I was going to say, what we're going to do now, and oh, awesome! Thank you so much, Zed. I appreciate that. So we're going to raid Homozygote, who is another educational streamer who streams about science. So make sure to please get into the machine. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. Is your dog named Speck? No, I have 3 puppies. None of them is named Speck though. Thank you. Anyways, I will see you all, I think, tomorrow if I can. So yeah, thank you so much.